there is a profound mystery about the decline of the Sumerians, a sense that a great people can see their world end, their irrigation channels turn to dust, their ziggurats crumble into the sand, and yet the people themselves do not vanish, but transform, carrying their culture forward into new lands, adapting, becoming something new. We see this same echo, the same profound mystery of origins, not in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, Sumer, but in the vast, shimmering expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the single largest feature on our planet. We are speaking tonight of a people who emerged from a homeland that is now only a memory, a place that is both a physical location and a spiritual concept. We are speaking of a people who achieved the near impossible, reading the subtle language of the ocean swells, the silent map of the stars, and the flight paths of migrating birds to sail against the prevailing winds across thousands of miles of empty water. They sailed to find the last great habitable islands on Earth, a land of mist, mountains, and giant flightless birds, a place they would eventually call Aotearoa. This is the story of the Maori. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. The story does not begin, as one might expect, with a footstep on a beach, but in the quiet, starlit waters of the Central Pacific, in the ancestral homeland known as Hawaii. Hawaii is not a single, locatable point on a modern map. It is not the same as Hawaii, though the names share a common linguistic root, a whisper of a shared past. Instead, Hawaii is a profound idea, a web of islands in eastern Polynesia, perhaps encompassing the Society Islands, the Cook Islands, or the Marquesas, that lived in the collective memory of the people. It was the place from which the great migratory waka, or canoes, were launched, and it was the place to which the Wairua, the spirit, would return upon death, following the setting sun back across the ocean pathway. It was the origin point, the source of mana and identity, and the place where the gods first gave rise to humanity. To leave Hawaii was not merely a journey, it was a severing, a courageous and desperate gamble to begin the world anew. For centuries, scholars debated the very possibility of this migration, imagining that the settlement of Polynesia and later Aotearoa must have been an accident, a series of unfortunate fishermen or storm-blown families pushed unwillingly into the vast unknown. But the evidence, both in oral tradition and in modern archaeology, paints a picture not of chance, but of deliberate, systematic, and breathtakingly skillful navigation. This was the final pulse of the greatest human migration in history, the Austronesian expansion, which had begun thousands of years earlier in Taiwan and had already populated the remote corners of the Pacific, from Easter Island to Hawaii. The settlement of Aotearoa was the last chapter in this extraordinary saga. The oral histories, passed down with meticulous care through generations of tohunga, priests or experts, recall the names of the navigators, the names of the canoes, and the reasons for the departure. They speak of internal strife, of conflicts over land or resources, of chiefs like Kupe, who, according to some traditions, pursued a great octopus across the ocean and became the first to sight the new land, returning with sailing directions for others to follow. The archaeological mystery, The silent evidence that gleams faintly beneath layers of earth concerns the timing of this final voyage. For a long time, a great fleet tradition dominated the narrative, suggesting a single, coordinated migration of multiple canoes arriving around 1350 AD. This idea, however, was in part a construction by early 20th century ethnographers, an attempt to create a tidy, almost classical origin story. The deeper, more complex truth lies in the soil and the pollen. Analysis of ancient pollen layers reveals the first significant widespread deforestation, the clearing of land by fire for settlement and agriculture, began not in 1350, but perhaps as early as 1280 AD. Further clues emerged from the bones of the Kiori, the Polynesian rat, which hitched a ride in the great canoes. Their gnawed seeds and tiny skeletons in the lowest, earliest archaeological layers confirm a human presence in the late 13th century. The scientific consensus now rests gently on this period from around 1250 to 1300 AD as the window when these first navigators made landfall. It was not a single fleet, perhaps, but a series of deliberate targeted voyages, likely spanning several generations, guided by the precise knowledge held by master navigators. These navigators, the Tohunga Tatai Ararangi, were scientists of the natural world. They carried no magnetic compasses, no charts on paper. Their maps were woven into the mind, into chants and stories that encoded the rising and setting points of specific stars, the star compass that allowed them to hold a bearing through the darkest night. They understood the ocean's surface not as a flat, empty void, but as a textured landscape of information. They could feel the subtle shift in the ocean swells, the way the waves refracted around distant, unseen atolls, telling them land was near long before it broke the horizon. They watched for the land-finding birds, the terns and boobies that flew out to fish in the morning and returned to their nests in the evening, their flight paths a living arrow pointing the way. They carried with them the essentials for survival, a portable Polynesia carefully stowed in the deep hulls of their double-hulled waka. The kumara, sweet potato, taro, and yam, along with the kurus, the now extinct Polynesian dog, and the aforementioned kiore. These vessels were not hollowed-out logs, but sophisticated ocean-going craft, some capable of carrying 60 to 100 people, their twin hulls lashed together with coconut fiber rope, their sails woven from pandanus leaf, designed to withstand the ferocious storms of the open Pacific. The journey was unimaginably perilous, a voyage of weeks, perhaps months, into the watery desert, driven by a need that must have outweighed the terror of the unknown, a testament to a courage that is difficult to comprehend from the comfort of our modern world. They were sailing south into colder, more tempestuous latitudes, searching for a land that until Kupe's return existed only in rumor. These were the vessels, the great Wakahurua, or twin-hulled voyaging canoes, that carried the seed of a new culture across the world's greatest ocean, propelled by an ancestral memory and a precise science of the stars. The story that solidified around these journeys, told and retold in the firelight of countless Werepuni sleeping houses for centuries, is the tradition of the Great Fleet, or Te Hekenga Nui. This was not remembered as a scattered handful of accidental arrivals, but as a purposeful, grand, and organized migration, a deliberate transplanting of a people from the diminishing opportunities of Hawaii to a vast, promising, and empty new land. It is an epic held in the oral memory, a foundational narrative that establishes the identity, the lineage, and the land rights of all who descend from those first voyagers. The tradition names these waka, and the names themselves resonate with genealogical power, for to be Maori is to know which of these canoes your ancestors arrived upon. The names are chanted like a roll call of founding ancestors, Tainui and Te Arawa, Mataatua and Kurahopo, Takitimu, Aotea, and Tokomaru. These are the principal vessels of the fleet, though other traditions and iwi, tribes, trace their lineage to different waka, such as the Haruta or the Nukutere. The oral histories are specific, not just about the canoes themselves, but about their crews and their commanders, the chiefs and the tohunga who guided them. The Te Arawa canoe, for instance, was said to be commanded by the chief Temate Kapua, but its spiritual guidance came from the great Tohunga Ngatoro Irangi, who would later be associated with the volcanic mountains of the central North Island. The Tainui was captained by Hotaroa, a quiet, contemplative chief, and its journey and eventual resting place would define the territory of the powerful Tainui Confederation of Tribes. The Tekatimu was described as a particularly sacred or tapu vessel, carrying priests and their sacred knowledge, its journey fraught with ritual danger. These were not mere transport ships. They were arks, each one a living, breathing entity, a microcosm of the society it carried, complete with its own social hierarchy, its own internal dramas, and its own divine protection, or mana. The journey itself, as preserved in these traditions, was an epic trial of endurance and faith. The navigators, remember, were reading the ocean swells and the star paths, but they were also contending with the gods. They chanted the ancient Karakia incantations to placate Tangaroa, the god of the sea, and to call upon Tauhirimatia, the god of winds, for favorable breezes. They navigated the treacherous storms that threatened to swamp the lashed hulls. The occupants huddled beneath makeshift shelters, chilled by the cold winds of the southern latitudes they were steadily entering. They carried with them the Maori, the life force of their homeland, often in the form of sacred stones, which they would place in the new land to sanctify it and bind it to Hawaii. They also carried the precious kumara tubers, wrapped carefully in bark cloth, shielded from the corrosive salt spray, as this tropical plant was their primary hope for a new agricultural life in a land whose native plants were largely unfamiliar and forbidding. The voyage was a bottleneck of survival, a test that forged the character of the people who stepped ashore, binding the survivors together with a shared experience of profound hardship and miraculous deliverance. This narrative, the arrival of a great fleet around 1350 AD, was recorded with great care by early European ethnographers, most notably S. Percy Smith, whose 1910 work, Hawaii, the original home of the Maori, presented this as a literal, factual history. This tidy, almost heroic narrative of a single, coordinated armada captured the colonial imagination and was, for a time, taught as orthodoxy. However, the scholarly view has since become more nuanced, peering into the historiographic mystery of the fleet itself. Modern archaeology and linguistics, as we noted, suggest a more complex settlement pattern, not a single event, but a series of voyages occurring over several generations, beginning around 1280 AD. It is now hypothesized that the Great Fleet tradition may have been a masterful act of cultural synthesis, a way for later generations to link their various ancestral lineages back to a single, powerful, and unifying event in Hawaii. It was a political and genealogical charter, a grand narrative that telescoped a century of migration into one momentous episode, simplifying and organizing the disparate stories of arrival into a cohesive national epic. In this view, Percy Smith was not necessarily recording a literal event, but rather the polished, finalized version of an oral tradition that had evolved over centuries to serve a vital social purpose. Yet, this scholarly distinction between a literal fleet and a synthesized tradition does not diminish the profound truth held within the story. The essential facts remain undisputed. The ancestors of the Maori were arguably the most skilled navigators of the pre-modern world. They crossed the vastest ocean on Earth in sophisticated double-hulled canoes. They did so deliberately, not by accident, and they carried with them the people, plants as animals, and gods necessary to found a new world. The Waka traditions are the scaffolding of Maori society. An individual's Wakapapa, or genealogy, is the central pillar of their identity, and that Wakapapa almost invariably begins with the name of the canoe that brought their ancestors to Aotearoa. When Maori formally introduce themselves, they name their mountain, their river, and their waka, thereby locating themselves not just in the present, but in the deep, flowing current of history. Whether the Tainui and Te Arawa arrived simultaneously in a single fleet or decades apart, they were the vessels that carried the lifeblood of a people, and their prows were about to cut through the stillness of a coastline that had never before reflected a human face. The prows of the Great Waka cut through the cold, unfamiliar coastal waters, pushing past the curtain of the ocean mist that so often clung to these shores. According to the oral traditions, the very first sight of this new world was a long, low bank of cloud clinging to the horizon, a sign of a significant landmass hidden beneath. It was this phenomenon that is said to have earned the land its most enduring name, as Kupe's wife, Hinete Aparangi, is said to have cried out, "He au, he au, he au te, he au te roa, a cloud, a white cloud, a long white cloud." Thus, the land was called Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, a name that perfectly captured the atmospheric, mist-shrouded nature of its first appearance to those voyagers from the sun-drenched tropics. Stepping ashore, the first explorers would have felt not the warm sands of a Polynesian atoll, but the cool, damp earth of a temperate forest floor, the air shockingly crisp and carrying the scent of unknown flora, of damp leaf mold, and the sharp tang of salt spray. This was not the Polynesia they had left behind. The transition was an immense sensory and ecological shock. In Hawaii, life was lived in a world of predictable warmth, beneath the familiar silhouettes of coconut palms, pandanus, and breadfruit trees, the reefs teeming with tropical fish. Our Aotearoa was, by contrast, a land of dramatic, almost brooding grandeur. It was a land of towering mountains capped with snow, of vast, dense forests of gigantic trees, kauri, totara, rimu, that formed a canopy so thick it shut out the sun, creating a world of deep, silent green. It was a land of geological turmoil, of volcanoes and geothermal springs, of fjords and glaciers in the far south. And it was cold. The sub-Antarctic winds that swept the southern part of the South Island were a profound challenge for a people accustomed to living in light, bark cloth wrappings. The familiar, life-sustaining plants of their homeland simply could not survive here, a devastating realization that must have dawned on them as they frantically searched for familiar food sources. But the land was not empty. It was a world ruled by birds. For 80 million years, New Zealand had evolved in splendid isolation, a fragment of the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana. With the exception of a few small species of bats, there were no native land mammals. This absence had created an ecological vacuum, and the birds had evolved to fill every niche. The forest floor was not prowled by large predators, but was instead the domain of flightless birds. The first people to step into these forests entered a symphony of birdsong, unlike anything else on Earth, and looming among them were the giants. This was the age of the moa, a family of enormous flightless birds, some species like the giant Dinornis, standing a truly shocking 12 feet tall, their heads reaching high into the forest understory. They were the great herbivores of this land, and stalking them was the largest eagle the world has ever known. The Haast's eagle, or Te Hokioi, a monstrous predator with a wingspan of 10 feet and talons the size of a tiger's claws, powerful enough to swoop down from the forest canopy and strike a moa at the neck. The first human settlements, therefore, clung to the coasts, where the sea, at least, offered familiar sustenance. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries illuminating this first chapter of human life is the Wairau Bar, at the mouth of the Wairau River in the South Island. Here, beneath the wind-blown sands, archaeologists unearthed the remains of a founding settlement, a place of immense importance dating back to the very earliest period of arrival, around 1280 to 1300 AD. The evidence gleaming in the silt provided a perfect snapshot of adaptation. The settlers were using the stone they could find in the new land, but they were shaping it with the precise techniques of their Polynesian homeland. They found beautiful adze heads, chipped from local argillite, but in a style identical to those found thousands of miles away in the Cook Islands. They found trolling lures for fishing, just as their ancestors had used, but fashioned from local bone and stone. Even more poignantly, the Wairau Bar was a resting place for the dead. The graves found there contained the first New Zealanders, and the adornments buried with them are a bridge back to Hawaii. They wore necklaces of moa eggs, drilled and strung together, and real ornaments carved from whale ivory. But the clearest link was the punamu, the precious New Zealand greenstone, and the remains of those who may have been the very first voyagers, their DNA linking them directly back to eastern Polynesia. This site is not just a settlement. It is perhaps a cemetery for that first generation, the Tupuna, who navigated the great ocean, a place where the memory of Hawaii was laid to rest in the soil of Aotearoa. From such coastal bases, the people began the slow, arduous process of learning their new home. They established networks of exploration, following the rivers inland and charting the coastlines, discovering the vital resources they would need. They found obsidian, the volcanic glass of Tuhua, Mare Island, which provided razor-sharp cutting edges. They located the specific quarries for the best adze-making stone, and most importantly, in the cold, wild rivers of the South Island, they discovered the translucent, spiritually potent punamu, a stone that would become the cultural heart of their new civilization, embodying the spirit of the land itself. The world these first people inhabited, this land of mists and giant birds, defined the first 2 centuries of their settlement in a distinct phase of history that archaeologists now call the Archaic period, lasting from that first arrival around 1280 AD until roughly 1500 AD. This was an era of exploration and exploitation, a time when the human population was small, highly mobile, and adapting to a landscape of seemingly limitless resources. These early settlers are often referred to, perhaps too simplistically, as the moa hunters, a name that captures the single most defining feature of their economy: their reliance on the great flightless birds that roam the forests and grasslands. The discovery of these enormous, walking food lockers must have been a revelation, a solution to the failure of their tropical breadfruit and coconut crops. Here was a source of meat on a scale they had never known, and the archaeological record, the silent testament of bones and cooking pits, shows they harvested this bounty with relentless, devastating efficiency. The hunting of the moa was a foundational activity for this early society. We can imagine the small bands of hunters moving through the strange, dense forests, using their cur, dogs, to track and corner the massive birds. The hunts themselves would have been dangerous, requiring immense cooperation. These were not small creatures, and a panicked Dinornis could easily injure a human. They used fire to clear sections of the forest, driving the birds into the open or into prepared ambushes, where they were dispatched with strong, fire-hardened wooden spears or stone-tipped lances. The evidence for this activity is stark, found in archaeological sites up and down the eastern side of the South Island, places like the mouth of the Rakaya River, where vast middens or refuse heaps are layered thick with the bones of thousands of butchered moa. It was less a hunt and more a mining operation, a systematic processing of a finite resource. Every part of the bird was used: the meat for food, the thick skins for cloaks and coverings, the bones for fashioning tools like fish hooks, awls, and personal adornments, and the enormous eggs, carefully drilled at one end, were used as water containers or sometimes broken and strung together to create the distinctive rattling necklaces found in the earliest graves. This abundance of protein, supplemented by the easily hunted seals that thronged the coastlines in vast colonies, shaped the entire culture of the Archaic period. Life was, for a time, relatively easy. The population grew, and settlements, like the one we remember at Wairau Bar, were typically unfortified and situated in prime locations at river mouths, giving access to the moa of the plains, the birds of the forest, and the rich life of the sea. The pa, the great hill forts that would come to define the later Maori landscape, were almost entirely absent in this era. This lack of defensive structures paints a picture of a society with less internal pressure, fewer reasons for intertribal warfare. There was ample land, ample food, and the primary conflicts were likely small-scale, personal, or ritualistic, rather than the large-scale territorial wars that would come later. The energy of the people was directed outward, toward the environment rather than inward, against each other. The technology of this period reflects this focus. The stone adzes, toki, were large, robust, and functional, designed for the heavy work of felling giant trees to build the all-important waka for travel and fishing, and for butchering moa and seals. The artistry, however, was reserved for personal adornment, and it is here we see the clearest cultural umbilical cord stretching back across the ocean to Hawaii. The jewelry of the moa hunters is profoundly Eastern Polynesian in its style. They wore real necklaces, intricate assemblies of drilled whale teeth or sections of moa bone, and pendants of whale ivory, often carved into shapes that are stylistic echoes of ornaments found thousands of miles away in the Marquesas. This cultural signature, found in the graves of their highest status individuals, is a poignant reminder that these were a Polynesian people still carrying the memory of their homeland, applying its artistic language to the new materials of Aotearoa. The punamu, the greenstone, was known and worked, but the forms were often simple, and it had not yet achieved the supreme, almost divine status it would acquire in the centuries to come. But this world, this hunter's paradise, was built on a fatal miscalculation. The Amoa, having evolved for millions of years with no significant ground predators, were ecologically naive. They were slow to mature and slow to breed. The hunting pressure, even from a relatively small human population, was simply more than their numbers could withstand. The ecological change was catastrophic and, in geological terms, terrifyingly swift. Within 100 to 150 years of the first human landfall, all 9 species of moa were gone. The great birds that had defined the ecosystem for millennia were hunted to complete extinction. Their disappearance triggered an immediate cascade. The Haast's eagle, Te Hokioi, which had preyed upon the moa, lost its primary food source, and likely hunted by humans as well, vanished from the skies, its existence fading into the realm of myth, remembered only as a terrifying, shadowy predator in oral folklore. The forests, once managed by the browsing of the moa, began to change, and the people who had built an entire way of life on this singular, abundant resource faced their first and most profound crisis. The golden age of the moa hunter was over, and a new, harder, and more innovative era was about to be born from its ashes. The great silence that fell upon the land in the wake of the moa's extinction was not just the absence of the giant birds, but the sound of a profound cultural crisis. The hunter's paradise, which had sustained the first generations in relative ease, had evaporated, its foundation of abundant protein mined to depletion within a handful of generations. The seals, too, were hunted from their vast mainland colonies, retreating to remote offshore islands. This was the first great turning point in the human story of Aotearoa, a moment of ecological reckoning that forced a fundamental choice: adapt or perish. The nomadic, mobile lifestyle of the archaic period was no longer viable, and survival now depended not on the pursuit of game, but on the systematic, laborious, and ingenious cultivation of the earth. The future of the people lay buried in the soil, in the precious tubers they had carried with them from Hawaii, most notably the kumara, the sweet potato. This transition was one of the great feats of agricultural innovation in human history. The kumara is a tropical plant, accustomed to the warm, consistent climates of eastern Polynesia, and the voyagers who stowed it in the hulls of their waka had brought it to a land that was by comparison cold, damp, and temperate, with a genuine winter and the ever-present threat of frost. Making this plant the new staple food of a growing population was not a simple matter of planting. It required the development of an entirely new and sophisticated horticultural technology. The early Maori became, in effect, brilliant applied scientists, modifying the very landscape to create microclimates capable of nurturing their tropical lifeline. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is written across the face of Aotearoa in vast patterned fields that can still be seen today, ghostly outlines of a forgotten agricultural industry. The first challenge was the soil and the cold. To overcome this, Maori gardeners developed the puke, or mound system, carefully scraping the topsoil into raised mounds. This simple technique served multiple purposes. It concentrated the nutrients, improved drainage in the often heavy soil, and most importantly, the mounded earth would catch more of the sun's warmth during the day, raising the soil temperature for the delicate tubers planted within. In many regions, they went even further, engaging in a monumental process of soil amendment. They quarried and transported tons of sand and fine gravel, often from coastal dunes or riverbeds, and meticulously mixed it into their garden plots. These plagan soils, as archaeologists sometimes call them, were a form of permanent mulching. The dark gravel absorbed solar heat, releasing it slowly through the night, acting like a stony blanket to protect the kumara from frost. The stones also helped retain moisture during dry spells and suppress the growth of competing weeds. The scale of this work is staggering. In some areas, like the volcanic slopes of Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, or the stony plains of the Wairarapa, these modified garden systems covered many square miles. Once the kumara was grown, it had to be stored, and this presented the second great challenge. A tuber left in the damp winter ground would rot, and a tuber exposed to a single frost would be destroyed, taking with it both the winter food supply and the seed stock for the following year. The solution was another remarkable invention, the Rua Kumara, or the subterranean storage pit. These were not simple holes. They were feats of engineering, meticulously designed to create a perfectly controlled environment of low temperature, low humidity, and darkness. Often, they were dug into south-facing slopes, away from the direct sun, or into dry, pumiceous subsoil. The classic rua was a bell-shaped pit, excavated through a narrow opening at the top, which could be sealed with a stone or a wooden plug, and then swelling into a larger chamber below, keeping the tubers safe from the elements, and just as importantly, from the kiore, the Polynesian rat. The survival of the community through the lean winter months depended entirely on the success of these storage pits, and they became a feature of every permanent settlement. This horticultural revolution, born of necessity, rebuilt Maori society from the ground up. Life was no longer nomadic. It became sedentary. People had to stay in one place to clear the land, build the gardens, tend the plants, and guard the precious Rua Kumara. This led directly to a new and powerful concept of land tenure. A specific piece of fertile, stone-worked garden land was now the most valuable resource a family group, or whanau, could possess, a legacy to be passed down and defended. With the kumara came the ability to create a surplus, a storable form of wealth. This surplus was the foundation of a more complex social structure. A rangatira, or chief, could now gain mana, prestige, not just through warfare or genealogy, but by skillfully managing the gardens and redistributing the stored food in great feasts, demonstrating his ability to provide for his people. Technology shifted as well. The adze, or toki, once a heavy-duty tool for felling and butchering, was refined. New, lighter forms emerged for clearing brush, and the development of the ko, a specialized foot-driven digging stick, became essential for turning the soil. With the moa gone and paunamu, greenstone, rising in value, the intricate wakairo, carving of ware, houses, and waka began to flourish, made possible by fine, sharp chisels chipped from this precious stone. The era of the hunter was over, and the era of the farmer, the warrior, and the artist had begun. The great moa was gone, and with its vanishing, the sky itself felt emptier, for the shadow of the giant hokioi eagle, its predator, also faded from the world, leaving only a whisper in the memory of the people. This was not a slow, gentle transition. It was an ecological termination, a profound and sudden closing of the door on the first chapter of human life in Aotearoa. The archaic period, that golden age of the hunter, had been built upon a resource that could not replenish itself, and its end forced a complete reimagining of what it meant to live in this land. The shift was absolute. The protein-rich, mobile lifestyle of the moa hunters gave way to the carbohydrate-based, sedentary, and laborious life of the gardener. And this change, driven by the success of the kumara, rippled outward, altering the very ecology of the islands and the structure of the society that depended on it. The world had changed forever, and the people were forced to change with it, entering a new, more challenging, and more competitive phase of their history. The most visible scar of this new era was written upon the landscape in smoke and fire. As the people turned from the dwindling megafauna to the soil, they used ahi, fire, as their primary tool for clearing the dense, ancient forests. The controlled burns that had once been used to flush moa were now employed on a massive scale to open up land for the all-important kumara gardens. But fire is a difficult servant, and in the drier eastern regions of both islands, these fires often burned far beyond their intended boundaries, consuming vast tracts of the podocarp forests that had stood for millennia. Over generations, this deliberate and accidental burning permanently transformed the ecosystem. Huge swathes of forest, particularly in areas like the Canterbury Plains and the Wairarapa, were replaced by a hardy, opportunistic successor, the bracken fern rarauhe. This new human-created landscape of open fernland was in itself a new kind of resource. The fern's rhizome, the aruhe, though tough and fibrous, was rich in starch. It became a vital secondary staple, a food of last resort when the kumara stores ran low. But harvesting and processing it, the laborious pounding and soaking, was arduous work, a constant reminder of the new, harder reality of subsistence. This horticultural revolution, however, was not uniform across Aotearoa, and its limitations created a profound divergence in Maori culture. The kumara was a tropical plant, and even with the brilliant innovations of gravel-mulched gardens and storage pits, there was a climatic line it could not reliably cross. In the warm, volcanic soils of the North Island, particularly in the Tamaki Isthmus, modern Auckland, and the Bay of Plenty, the kumara thrived, producing reliable, storable surpluses. This abundance allowed for a significant and rapid growth in population. But in the colder, wetter climate of the South Island, Te Waipunamu, especially south of the Banks Peninsula, cultivating the kumara was a gamble that failed more often than it succeeded. The people of the South, therefore, could not rely on agriculture. They were forced to adapt in a different direction, maintaining a more mobile, hunter-gatherer lifestyle reminiscent of the Archaic period, though now focused on more resilient resources. They hunted birds, fished, gathered eels from the rivers, and harvested the remaining seal colonies on remote offshore islands. Their population density remained low, their settlements small and often seasonal. This divergence created two distinct cultural trajectories: a densely populated, agricultural, and increasingly militaristic north, and a sparsely populated, mobile, and trade-focused south. The great engine of change, however, was in the north. The very success of the Kumara became a new kind of trap. The population, once small and nomadic, was now booming, and these larger populations were permanently tethered, in fact, to the finite patches of fertile, well-drained, north-facing land suitable for gardening. For the first time, land itself, not just the creatures on it, became the most valuable commodity. A Wanao, family group, or Hapu, sub-tribe, was now defined by the specific garden plots it had cleared, worked with stones, and defended. Ownership was no longer a vague sense of territory. It was a precise, genealogically proven right to a specific piece of cultivated earth, a right established by Ahike, the burning fires of continuous occupation. A resource that is valuable, finite, and essential will always, in human history, become a source of conflict. This, then, was the profound shift forced by the vanishing of the moa. The central conflict of Maori society turned inward. The primary struggle was no longer between humanity and the environment. It was between human groups competing for control of that environment. The old, undefended coastal settlements of the Archaic period, like Wairau Bar, were abandoned. They were too exposed, too vulnerable. Security became the paramount concern. People began to cluster together in larger permanent villages, or kainga, and they began to build these villages in places that were naturally defensible, on steep volcanic cones, sharp ridge lines, or isolated headlands protected by cliffs. The era of peaceful exploration was definitively over. The foundations of the classic Maori period were being laid, a period that would be defined by intricate genealogies, a complex social hierarchy, and the rise of the most visible and dramatic feature of the new Maori world, the fortified pa. The age of the hunter had ended. The age of the warrior farmer had begun. This urgent, pressing need for security, born from the new reality of a sedentary, agricultural, and expanding population, became the defining feature of a new era, a period we now call the classic Maori period, which dawned around 1500 AD. The open, undefended kainga of the Archaic period were now a relic of a more innocent past. The future belonged to the fortress. This new world was built upon the most dramatic and enduring monuments of Maori civilization, the fortified pa. A pa was far more than a simple village. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, a stronghold designed to protect the people, their precious Kumara stores, and the mana of their community. The landscape of the North Island, in particular, was transformed into a network of these formidable strongholds, their earthen ramparts still visible today, etched into the volcanic cones, coastal headlands, and sharp ridgelines, a silent, powerful testament to an age of intense competition. The rise of the PA was the logical and necessary consequence of the horticultural revolution, where the kumara could be grown, and more importantly, stored as a surplus. Populations boomed. These large, static populations were now anchored to their meticulously prepared garden soils, those stony, mulched fields that represented generations of backbreaking labor. This land was now the single most valuable resource, a legacy to be defended at all costs, and the Rua Kumara, the subterranean pits that held the winter food supply, were the community's treasury and its very lifeblood. This combination of a valuable, storable food surplus and a fixed, high-density population created the classic ingredients for territorial warfare, and the PA was the architectural response to this new, constant threat. The Tamaki Isthmus, the narrow neck of land where modern Auckland now stands, is perhaps the most striking example on Earth. Its landscape of dozens of small, extinct volcanic cones was turned into a vast complex of fortified cities, one of the most densely populated and militarized regions in all of Polynesia. The engineering of these strongholds reveals a profound understanding of both terrain and tactical psychology. The first principle was location. A pa was almost never built on flat, open ground. Its builders used the natural landscape as their first and most important line of defense. They chose the steep-sided volcanic cones, mawunga, the high promontories overlooking rivers, or the coastal headlands protected on three sides by sheer, unscalable cliffs. The builders would then meticulously sculpt these natural features, enhancing their defensibility through a combination of earthworks, timber, and stone. The most visible features were the massive ditches, or awa, and the high defensive banks, or maioro. These were not mere trenches. They were deep, wide moats, often dug in multiple concentric rings running around the contours of the hill, creating a deadly series of obstacles for any attacking force. The earth excavated from the ditch was piled high on the inner side to create a steep rampart, a wall of earth that was difficult to climb and provided a high vantage point for the defenders. Atop these ramparts stood the second layer of defense, the te wada, or palisade. This was a formidable fence, not of simple posts, but of thick, upright logs, often bound together with tough forest vines. These palisades were fighting platforms in their own right, sometimes built with an internal walkway, allowing defenders to stand protected and rain down stones and spears upon the attackers struggling in the ditch below. The posts themselves were often carved, the entranceways guarded by fierce, defiant figures, teko, designed not just to hold the line physically, but to project the spiritual power of the hapu and to psychologically intimidate the enemy. The entrances were the PA's most vulnerable point, and they were defended with ingenious, deadly complexity. A gateway was never a simple opening, but a twisting, narrow maze, ungutu, lips, that forced an attacking warrior to slow down, turn sideways, and expose their unshielded side to the defenders hidden in the bastions above, effectively breaking a charge and forcing the attackers to be dispatched one by one in a controlled killing zone. Inside these walls, the PA was a complex, terraced, and thriving community. The sloping sides of the hill were flattened into tuapapa, or terraces, where the ware houses were built, their thatched roofs clustered closely together. The summit, the most secure and sacred location, was the tihi, reserved for the Ware Tapere, House of Amusement, or the Ware Wanangas, House of Learning, and the residence of the Rangatira, the chief. And dug deep into the dry earth of the terraces, safe from fire and theft, were the all-important Rua Kumara, the pits holding the community's wealth. The PA was thus a fortress, a food bank, a home, and a statement. It was the ultimate symbol of the mana and identity of the Hapu sub-tribe. A large, complex PO was a visible proclamation of the chief's power, his ability to command the labor to build it, and the warriors to defend it. It was the Turangawaiwai, the standing place, the ancestral anchor of the people, its name woven into their Wakapapa genealogy. This was the new crucible of Maori society, a fortified world that forged a new social order based on land, lineage, and the ever-present possibility of war. Life within those formidable ramparts, those earthen walls and palisades we remember from the volcanic cones, was a dense, smoky, and communal existence, a constant hum of social industry. From the pre-dawn chill, when the mist still lay thick in the ditches, the paw would stir, the air slowly filling with the scent of wood smoke from 1,000 cooking fires, the sounds of voices calling between the terraced ware, the rhythmic thud of weavers beating flax, and the sharp, percussive click of stone chisels shaping wood. This was not a loose collection of families, but a highly organized, stratified, and interdependent society, a human mechanism as carefully engineered as the fortress that contained it. The pressures of the classic period, the need to defend the land, manage the Kumara surplus, and wage successful war, had forged a rigid social pyramid, a structure based on the immutable principle of Wakapapa, the unbroken chain of genealogy that connected every individual through their ancestors back to the gods themselves. At the very pinnacle of this structure was the Rangatira, the chief. This individual, almost always male, was the head of the Hapu sub-tribe, or, in the case of a paramount chief, the Ariki, the leader of an entire Idowi tribe. His position was not earned by popular vote or seized in a coup. It was an inherited right, a sacred duty passed down the senior-most male line from a founding ancestor who had arrived on one of the great waka. The Rangatira was the living vessel of the community's mana, that complex and vital concept of prestige, authority, spiritual power, and honor. His body was tapu, sacred, his head especially so, and his ability to govern was seen as a direct reflection of the god's favor. A successful Rangatira was one whose gardens flourished, whose warriors were victorious, and whose people were prosperous. He was the chief executive, directing the communal efforts of planting and harvesting, managing the redistribution of the vital Kumara surplus from the storage pits he controlled. He was the chief diplomat, forging alliances with other Hapu, often through strategic marriages of his children, and he was the commander-in-chief, deciding when to wage war and leading his warriors in battle. In matters of the spirit, the Rangatira was advised and often rivaled in status by the Tohunga, the expert or priest. The Tohunga was the Hapu's keeper of specialized sacred knowledge. There were many kinds. The Tohunga Ahurewa, high priest, who knew the most sacred karakia, incantations, to mediate between the people and the gods. The Tohunga Wakairo, the master carver, who could release the ancestral spirits sleeping in the wood, and the Tohunga Tatai Arorangi, the astronomer who read the stars to determine the precise, auspicious time for planting the Kumara. This class of specialists was essential for maintaining the spiritual and intellectual balance of the community. They were the historians, the scientists, and the theologians, preserving the Wakapapa and the oral traditions with meticulous accuracy, ensuring that the rituals that maintained the world's order, its Maori, or life force, were performed correctly. To build a great waka or a new meeting house without the guidance of a tohunga was to invite disaster. Below these leaders were the vast majority of the PA's inhabitants, the tutua or commoners. These were not a separate, unrelated class. They were the Wanao families of the Hapu, related to the Rangatira through junior genealogical lines. They were the engine of the society. They were the men who built the ditches, sharpened the palisade posts, and stood watch on the ramparts. They were the warriors, Te-O-A, who formed the bulk of any war party, their own mana enhanced by their skill and bravery. They were the women who spent countless hours weaving the flax into cloaks, kakahu, baskets, kete, and fishing nets, and who did the primary work of planting and harvesting the gardens. They were the fishers who braved the coast in their waka, and the fowlers who set snares in the forest. Theirs was a life of communal obligation, bound by loyalty to their chief and their shared ancestry. In return for their labor and their military service, they were protected within the Pi'au and received their share of the Kumara surplus, their rights to their own family garden plots, guaranteed by the Hapu's collective strength. At the very bottom of this hierarchy, existing almost outside the genealogical system, were the Taurekareka, the slaves. This class was a direct product of the endemic warfare that characterized the classic period. A Taurekareka was a person, man, woman, or child, who had been captured in a raid, their mana completely extinguished by the fact of their defeat. They were property. They had no rights, no wakapapa within their captor's tribe, and no social standing. Their lives were dedicated to the most menial and degrading tasks, hauling firewood and water up the steep slopes of the Pias, processing the tough, fibrous fern root, or carrying the heavy loads of their masters. Their existence was entirely precarious. While many were integrated as a permanent hereditary servant class, their lives were ultimately forfeit to the will of their owners. In some of the more terrible rituals, a Taurekareka might be sacrificed to sanctify the building of a new pa, or the launching of a new war canoe, their death considered a necessary offering to the gods. Social mobility in this world was almost non-existent. One was born a rangatira, or a tutua. The only significant, terrifying change in status was the fall, through the misfortune of war, from a tutua, or even a rangatira, of a defeated tribe, into the social death of a Taurekareka. This rigid tripartite structure, chief, commoner, and slave, all guided by the tohunga, was the essential framework that allowed these fortified communities to not only survive, but to flourish in a landscape where every neighbor was a potential rival. The rigid, hierarchical world of the Piau, with its defended terraces and guarded gates, was a direct response to the central, driving force of the classic Maori period: endemic, intertribal conflict. The PA was not a monument built in hope of peace, but a tool forged for a world in which warfare was an inevitable, seasonal, and necessary part of life, as predictable as the planting of the kumara. This constant state of potential hostility was not driven by simple bloodlust or a desire for conquest, as a modern mind might understand it. It was regulated by a complex and profound legal and spiritual concept, a principle that sat at the very heart of the Maori worldview. This concept was utu, a term that is often and far too simply translated as revenge. Its true meaning is far deeper, closer to reciprocity, balance, or an equivalent, a binding obligation to repay any act, whether that act was a gift, an insult, or an act of violence. Utu was the engine of the social universe, the mechanism by which the spiritual balance sheet of mana was kept. In this worldview, every action created an imbalance. A gift created an obligation for a greater gift in return. An insult, a theft, or a murder, however, created a spiritual debt that corroded the mana of the affected hapu. This was not a minor offense. It was a tear in the fabric of the cosmos, a diminishing of the tribe's life force and prestige. If this debt was not settled, the mana of the group, and especially its rangatira, would drain away, leaving them spiritually weakened and vulnerable. The gods would turn their faces away. Utu was the necessary, non-negotiable act of rebalancing that account. A war party, a taua, was not merely a punitive expedition. It was a sacred, ritualized, and legally mandated mission to restore that balance. The only way to cleanse the stain of a transgression was to inflict an equivalent, or slightly greater, transgression upon the offenders or their kin. This created, of course, a new imbalance for the other side, which they, in turn, were now spiritually bound to answer, creating a perpetual cycle of obligations that could bind hapu and iwi together for generations in a complex dance of alliance and enmity. This principle of balance could also be maintained through a related non-lethal mechanism called muru. Muru was a form of restorative, plundering justice, often applied within a larger tribal group to settle a transgression without resorting to open warfare. If, for example, a man committed adultery, or if a child was accidentally injured or killed while under another's care, it was an offense against the mana of the wronged party, the husband, or the child's mother's family. A taua muru would descend upon the offender's settlement, but instead of killing, they would ritualistically plunder the offender's property, seizing fine cloaks, punamu, greenstone weapons, and preserved foods. The offender was expected to submit to this plunder without resistance. To fight back would be a grievous offense, escalating the muru into a true, bloody utu. By accepting this plunder, the offender acknowledged their wrongdoing, the debt was paid, and the mana of the wronged party was satisfied, allowing social cohesion to be restored. It was a pressure release valve, a way to settle accounts without shattering the tribe. When muru was not enough, however, the full taua was gathered. Warfare was seasonal, undertaken after the kumara harvest was safely stored in the rua, and before the planting season began, when the men were available and the food supplies could support a campaign. A taua was formed by a rangatira who had a take, a cause, a debt of utu that needed to be paid. He would send messages to his allies, and the warriors, the to'os, would gather, their bodies and minds prepared for the transition from the mundane world to the sacred tapu state of war. This preparation was both physical and spiritual, culminating in the haka, a ritual dance that was far more than a simple challenge. The haka was a communal transformation, a way to unify the war party's intentions, to call upon their ancestral gods for power, to awaken their ihi, personal magnetism, and wihai, Oh, and to bring the warriors to a peak of focused, collective ferocity. It was a psychological tool for the warriors themselves, binding them into a single, terrifying entity. The goal of the Tawa was not necessarily the annihilation of the enemy or the permanent conquest of their entire territory, though that could be a consequence. The primary goal was to satisfy the take, to inflict a balancing loss. This might be achieved through a wakakwau, a surprise ambush, or more commonly, by laying siege to the enemy's pa. The attacking Tawa would build its own temporary fortified camp outside the palisades, and a long, drawn-out battle of insults, skirmishes, and psychological warfare would begin, sometimes lasting for weeks. The attackers would try to exhaust the defenders' food and water supplies, or to find a weakness in the defenses, often using fire against the wooden palisades. The PA's complex, maze-like entrances were designed precisely for this moment, to break the charge of an attacking force and allow the defenders to dispatch them one by one. The weapons were brutal and personal, long, stabbing spears, tau, thrown turu, darts, and in the close, desperate melee, the vicious clubs of the patu, short club, and the aristocratic deadly mir, the short, flat-bladed club carved from precious punamu, which could split a skull in a single blow. If the PA fell, the cost for the defeated was absolute. Their kumara stores were seized, their homes burned, their mana shattered, and the survivors were either killed or, perhaps worse, captured. These captives, the taurekareka we remember, became the slaves, the living symbol of their tribe's defeat. The utu was paid, the balance restored, but a new debt had just been entered onto the long, patient ledger of history, awaiting its own season for repayment. The world of the PA, defined as it was by the stark necessities of defense and the cyclical obligations of utu, was simultaneously the crucible for one of the most sophisticated and spiritually integrated artistic cultures in the Pacific. While the ramparts and ditches spoke of war, the great houses within those walls spoke of genealogy, of divinity, and of beauty. The same mana that a rangatira protected with palisades and warriors, he also expressed and magnified through the patronage of the sacred arts, which flourished in the heart of the stronghold. These arts, of carving, of weaving, and of performance, were not hobbies or mere decorations. They were the visual and sonic language of Wakapapa, a way to make the ancestral and divine order of the universe manifest in the everyday world. They were, in essence, history and theology made tangible, a way to weave the past into the living present. The supreme expression of this was the Ware Wakairo, the great carved meeting house, which stood on the marae, the central plaza, at the heart of the P. This building was the Hapu's autobiography, its sacred library, and its parliament, all rendered in wood, shell, and flax. Its very architecture was a genealogy. The Ware was understood as the body of a primary ancestor. The carved figure, or tekateko, at the apex of the roof gable was the head. The long, sweeping barge boards, the maihi, were the arms, outstretched to welcome the people, and the roro, the covered porch, was the ancestor's face, with the doorway as the mouth, so that to enter the house was to pass into the ancestor's body, into the protective embrace of the tribe's lineage. The central ridgepole, the tahuhu, was the spine, and the interior rafters, the heike, were the ribs, each one often named for a specific descendant. To create such a house was an undertaking of immense tapu, sacred restriction. The work was overseen by a Tohunga Wakairo, a master carver who was both a supreme artist and a priest. He was the only one who could wield the stone and Paunamu chisels, the wau, to release the ancestral forms sleeping within the giant totara trees felled for the house. The carvers and the house itself, while under construction, were under strict ritual prohibitions. Food could not be brought near, and women, with the exception of a specific high-status woman performing a ritual role, were forbidden from the site, lest the tapu be broken and the project be cursed. The carvings themselves, the pupu or wall slabs that lined the interior, were not generic figures. Each was a literal portrait of a specific ancestor, a named link in the Wakapapa chain. The intricate surface patterns that covered every inch of the carving, the spirals, the notches, and the crescent-shaped unonahi, fish scales, were not mere filler, but a visual language conveying movement, energy, and the mana of the figure. In the warm, smoky dark of the ware, lit by a central fire, these ancestors would seem to move in the flickering light, their paua shell eyes gleaming, a living audience to the deliberations of their descendants. This art of Wakairo carving extended beyond the meeting house. It gave life to the towering Waharoa gateway of the Piau, a massive, intricately carved sentinel designed to project the hapu's power and spiritually repel enemies. It imbued the great war canoes, the Wakatawa, with terrifying speed and presence, their prows a tangle of spiraling forms, their stern posts rising like intricate monuments. And it personalized the instruments of life and war. The waka huia, or treasure boxes, which held the sacred huia feathers and paunamu adornments of the chief, were carved with such breathtaking complexity that every surface, including the underside, visible only when the box was hung from the rafters, was a masterpiece of flowing design. Even the weapons we remember, the taiaha, long staff, and the mere greenstone club, were imbued with carving, each with its own name and its own Maori, or life force, its own history of the battles it had seen and the utu it had exacted. If carving was the great male art form, its equivalent in female mana was the art of raranga, or weaving, and the preparation of harakeke, the New Zealand flax. This was an equally sacred and complex process, also governed by its own karakia, incantations, and prohibitions, its knowledge passed down through generations of women. The flax leaf itself was seen as a family. The central shoot, rito, was the child, protected by the parent leaves, awarua, on either side. A weaver would never cut the rito, ensuring the plant's continuity. The flax fibers, the muka, were extracted by scraping the tough leaf with a sharp mussel shell, a laborious process that yielded a silky, strong, and lustrous white thread. From this fiber, women wove the essentials of life, the kete, baskets, for carrying kumara, the floor mats, wariki, that lined the ware, and the sails for the canoes. Their highest art form, however, was the kakahu, the cloak. These were items of immense prestige, the embodiment of wealth and mana. While simple cloaks provided warmth, the fine cloaks, the kakahu rangatira, were masterpieces. The kahu huruhuru, or feather cloak, was a relatively later development. A stunning garment where the muka foundation was completely covered in the iridescent feathers of the tua, the green and bronze kareru, wood pigeon, or the crimson of the kaka, parrot, Stitched in so densely they created a shimmering, lightweight, and profoundly beautiful symbol of rank. Even more prized by some was the kaitaka, a cloak woven from the finest, softest muka fiber, bleached to a pale gold, its surface shimmering like silk. The true virtuosity of the weaver was displayed in the tanako, the intricate, geometric, multicolored border of these fine cloaks. Tanako is a unique, finger-twining technique, creating patterns that look almost like embroidery, a visual language of triangles, chevrons, and diamonds that held its own symbolic meanings, a final, perfect expression of the weaver's genius. These arts were not silent. They were given voice and movement in the ware tapper, the house of entertainment, the domain of performance. Here, the history carved on the walls and woven into the cloaks was brought to life. This was the origin of kepa haka, group performance. The moteatea, the great classical chants, were performed, their haunting microtonal melodies carrying the genealogies, the laments for the dead, and the stories of the gods. The po'ai, a dance now primarily performed by women using soft, flax fiber balls on strings, was, according to some traditions, originally a practice for male warriors to develop the wrist strength and flexibility needed to wield the patu and mirror in close combat. And as we know, there was the haka, not just a prelude to war, but a complex, ritualized performance used to welcome distinguished guests onto the marae, to celebrate a victory, to mourn a chief, or to debate a political point with the ultimate physical and vocal intensity. In the firelight of the ware wakairo, surrounded by the gleaming eyes of the ancestors on the walls, the haka would unify the living hapu with their past, the sound of their feet stamping on the earth, their voices raised as one, a final powerful assertion of their enduring mana. Beyond the carved house and the woven cloak, there was one final, more intimate canvas upon which the ancestral story was written, a canvas of profound personal and spiritual significance. This was the human skin, and the art was tomoko, the unique Maori practice of tattoo. This was not, as a modern mind might assume, a form of self-expression or mere bodily adornment in the pursuit of fashion. It was a sacred and deeply serious act of inscription, a visual language that rendered a person's entire identity, their genealogy, their social rank, their achievements, and their tribal affiliations, legible upon their face and body. A person of high status, a rangatira, or an ariki, did not wear a moko, they became their moko. It was the public declaration of their wakapapa, an unforgeable passport that announced exactly who they were in the highly structured world of the PA. The process of receiving moko was a ritual steeped in tapu. The artist, the tohunga tamoko, was a figure of immense prestige and spiritual power, a specialist who held the sacred knowledge of the patterns and the karakia, incantations, necessary to perform the operation safely. The tohunga was not just a craftsman, he was a priest, mediating between the physical and spiritual worlds, as the act of drawing blood and marking the head, the most tapu part of the body, was fraught with spiritual danger. The recipient was also placed in a state of tapu for the duration of the painful, multi-day process. They were secluded, and because their head was sacred and their hands were contaminated by contact with their bleeding skin, they were forbidden from feeding themselves. Food was given to them in liquid form, poured through a special, intricately carved wooden funnel, the korere, to prevent any mundane item, like food or a non-tapu hand, from touching the sacred, wounded site and thus polluting the moko and inviting spiritual disaster. The tools and the technique of traditional te moko are what truly set it apart from all other forms of Polynesian tattoo or te taus. Where other Polynesian cultures used a series of needles to puncture the skin and stain it, the Maori tohunga used a set of miniature chisels, or uhi. These were not needles, they were blades. They were fashioned from sharpened bone, often the bone of an albatross, hafted to a small wooden handle. The tohunga would dip the uhi into the pigment, a dark, sooty ink called ngarahu, made from the burnt resin of the kauri tree, or from specific dried caterpillars, which was also imbued with its own mori, or life force. He would then place the chisel against the skin and strike it with a small, light mallet, the ta, driving the blade deep enough to cut a groove into the flesh. The sound of the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the mallet on the bone chisel was the soundtrack of this transformation, a sound that would echo in the pia as a new identity was being forged in blood. This was, in effect, a form of scarification as much as tattooing. The uhai did not just inject pigment, it carved the skin, leaving a permanent grooved texture. As the wound healed, the skin would form ridges and valleys, a tactile three-dimensional pattern. A warrior's face was not just colored, it was engraved, the spirals and lines following the contours of the facial muscles, so that when he spoke or performed the haka, the moko itself would seem to move and writhe, amplifying the ferocity and power of his expression. The pain was, by all accounts, excruciating, a supreme test of endurance. To flinch, to cry out, or to abandon the process unfinished was a source of immense shame. To endure it stoically was a sign of the profound mana and strength required of a leader. The designs themselves were the language. For a high-ranking man, the full-face moko was his entire history. It was not an off-the-shelf design. It was a unique text composed by the tohunga in consultation with the wanao. The face was divided into distinct sections. The ngakai pikirau on the forehead denoted his rank. The ngunga on the area around the nose and upper cheeks declared his hapu, sub-tribe. The uira on the jawline recorded his wakapapa, or genealogy, and the rauru on the chin signaled his personal signature, or a specific great achievement. The flowing, double, and triple spirals, the kohiri, were not random. They were a visual representation of the branching lines of his ancestry. To see a man with a full moko was to see his lineage walking toward you, and to be able to read that moko was to know his name, his father's name, his tribe, and his right to be there. For high-status women, the moko was equally significant, though typically, and most famously, applied to the chin, the moko kawae. This was a mark of their noble birth, their connection to the genealogical line, and a profound symbol of their mana and their beauty. The patterns on the chin would again relate to their specific family and hapu. Often, the lips were also tattooed, outlined, and filled with a deep, dark blue-black pigment, a feature considered the height of female beauty and status. In some regions, women of very high rank might also receive small, delicate markings on the forehead or at the corners of the nostrils. The moko kawae was a woman's link to her ancestors, a sign of her power and her place within the sacred order of the world. In a culture without written language, ta moko was the ultimate text, the living history book of the people, carved not in stone, but in the very flesh of the ancestors who walked the earth. This intricate, sacred system of Wakapapa that was carved into the skin, the wood, and the social hierarchy all flowed from a single, ultimate source, the very creation of the cosmos. The Maori worldview was not a separate, abstract philosophy. It was the active, breathing foundation for every aspect of life, from the planting of the kumara to the waging of utu. It was a theology that began, as all great origin stories do, not in a void, but in a state of profound, absolute potential. In the beginning, there was Te Kore, the void, the nothingness. This was not an empty space, but a state of latent energy, of unformed possibility. From Te Kore emerged Te Po, the long, unbroken, and genealogical night, a darkness that was itself personified in a series of aeons, each one deeper and more intense, a slow gestation in the cosmic womb. And within this immense, generative darkness, two beings came into existence. They were Ranjanui, the Sky Father, and Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, or simply Rangi and Papa. In this primordial time, Rangi and Papa were locked in a single, passionate, and eternal embrace. Rangi lay upon Papa, his body covering hers completely, and in the suffocating, lightless, and warm darkness between them, their children were born. These children were not human. They were the Atua, the gods, the divine ancestors, and personifications of all the forces of the natural world. But their existence was one of misery. They lived in a perpetual, cramped gloom, unable to stand, unable to see, their limbs bent and pressed between the immense bodies of their parents. The darkness was absolute, and they yearned for a different kind of existence, for movement, for space, and for Marama, the light. This was the first great dilemma, the first take or cause that set the universe in motion, a divine desire for freedom that echoes the human struggle for mana. The children, the Atua, began to counsel amongst themselves in the crushing dark, their whispers a stir of new energy in the static world. How could they find a way to live? How could they find the light? The most aggressive of the children, Tumatawenga, the god of humanity and of war, the fiery, upright, and relentless ancestor of mankind, spoke first. His solution was brutal, direct, and driven by a cold logic. The only way to be free, he argued, was to kill their parents. This, he reasoned, would solve the problem permanently, severing the bond and letting the light in. But his brothers recoiled from this, from the parricide that Tumatawenga proposed. The gentler heart of Tain Mahuta, the god of the forests, the birds, and all things that grow, spoke next. Tain argued for a different path. They should not kill their parents, whom they loved, but separate them. Let us, he proposed, thrust our father Rangiva far up into the sky, to be a stranger to us, and let our mother Papa remain below, as a parent for us. One by one, the brothers tried, and one by one they failed. Rongo Matani, the goddess of the Kumara and all cultivated foods, pushed with all his might, but the embrace held. Then Tangaroa, the god of the sea and all its creatures, pushed, and the parents did not move. Haumia Tikataik, the god of the wild fern root and uncultivated foods, also tried and failed. Even the fierce Tumatawenga, who had proposed their death, could not budge them. The separation seemed impossible. Finally, it was the turn of Tain Mahuta, who had first proposed the plan. But Tan did not push with his hands, as his brothers had done. He did something profound, something symbolic of his domain. He lay upon his back, on the breast of his mother Papa, and he planted his feet firmly against the chest of his father Rangi. With the immense, slow, and irresistible strength of a growing tree, Tane began to push. He straightened his powerful legs, his back bracing against the earth, and with a series of mighty, agonizing thrusts, he began to wrench the sky from the earth. The separation was an act of cosmic, tearing violence. Rangi and Papa cried out in agony and disbelief, their love turning to grief as they were ripped apart. Their divine blood, spilled in this separation, rained down upon the earth, staining the soil red in certain sacred places, creating the kokowai, the red ochre that Maori would later use to paint their carved houses and to adorn their bodies. As Tane pushed Rangi ever higher, the children for the first time saw the light. The Marama flooded into the world, a pale, shocking, and beautiful illumination that revealed the world and each other for the first time. The children of Rangi and Papa, who had lived as crawling creatures in the dark, could finally stand upright. This act, the separation, is known as Te Wehenga, and it is the true moment of creation. It is the act that brought light to the world, that established the heavens above and the earth below, and that created the space between them, the Atea, for all life to flourish. But not all the children had agreed to this. One brother, Tauhiri Matea, the god of the winds and storms, had been silent during the council. He loved his parents, and he had been filled with rage at the idea of separating them. As Rangi was thrust into the sky, Tauhiri Matea, in his grief and fury, flew upwards to join his father in the heavens. From there, he waged a bitter, eternal war against his terrestrial brothers, unleashing his children, the winds, the GEO, the hurricanes, and the storm clouds, to punish the earth below. He attacked Tain, and the forests buckled and broke. He attacked Tangaroa, and the god of the sea fled in terror, stirring the oceans into massive churning waves. The fish and reptiles of Tangaroa were scattered, the fish fleeing deep into the sea, while the reptiles crawled ashore to seek shelter in the forests of Taini, creating an enduring enmity between the sea and the land. Tauhiri Matea then attacked Rongo Matane and Haumia Tikatike, but their mother, Papa, in a final act of maternal protection, drew them into her own body, hiding the Kumara and the fern root just beneath the surface of the earth, where Tauhiri Mate's Oa's winds could not find them. The only brother who stood firm, who did not flee, was the fierce Tumatawenga, the god of war, the ancestor of man. He stood fast on the breast of Papa, his feet planted firmly, and he defied the storms of Tauhiri Matea. When the winds finally abated, Tumatawenga looked around and was filled with contempt for his brothers who had hidden or fled. In his anger, he turned on them, creating the rituals of Utu and warfare. He wove snares to catch the children of Tane, the birds. He created nets to haul in the children of Tangaroa, the fish, and he fashioned the ko, digging stick, to dig up the children of Rongo and Haumia, the cultivated and uncultivated plants. By eating his brother's children, Tumatawenga asserted his dominance, establishing the right of humanity to consume the natural world. And so, the world was set in order. Rangi remains in the sky, his tears falling as rain upon his beloved Papa, who sighs in her grief as mist rising from the mountains. Tauhiri Matea wages his endless war from above, and humanity, the descendants of Tumatawenga, must navigate this world of conflict and reciprocity, forever caught between the sky and the earth. The world that Tumatawenga, the defiant ancestor of humanity, had secured by force was not an empty one. It was a cosmos shot through with the divine energy of his siblings, the Atua, who had hidden in the sea, the earth, and the forests. This world, born from the violent Te Wahenga, the separation of Rangi and Papa, was therefore not a mundane physical realm. It was a landscape of interacting, invisible forces, a place where every rock, river, and person was saturated with spiritual potential and subject to a complex and binding set of physical and metaphysical laws. To navigate this life successfully, to plant a crop, win a battle, or even safely have a child, required a profound understanding of this unseen operating system. This system was regulated by three great interlocking concepts, the principles that formed the very physics of the Maori universe: tapu, mana, and Maori. The first and most powerful of these forces was tapu. This is a word that has entered English as taboo, but its translation, as simply forbidden, is a pale shadow of its true, profound meaning. Tapu is not merely a prohibition, it is a state of being, a sacred restriction, a connection to the divine. It is the raw power of the gods, inherent in all things that trace their origin back to the Atua. Because the gods were tapu, the entire world was, to varying degrees, tapu. A rangatira, or an ariki, was deeply tapu because his wakapapa was a direct senior line back to the gods. His body, and especially his head, was a conduit for that divine power. A newborn child of high rank was tapu. A tohunga performing his rituals was tapu. A warrior preparing for battle, his body dedicated to the god Tumatawenga, was tapu. A war party, a taua, was intensely tapu. Even places could be tapu. A burial ground, urupa, a site where blood had been shed in fulfillment of utu, or the summit of a mountain that touched the realm of Rangis, were all permanently set apart. Tapu was, in essence, a form of spiritual electricity. It was a state of immense power, but also of immense danger. Its function was twofold. It protected the divine from being polluted by the mundane, and it protected the mundane from being overwhelmed by the raw, dangerous power of the divine. To break a tapu was not a simple social faux pas. It was a cosmic transgression that courted disaster. It was an act of pollution that would anger the Atua, who would in turn withdraw their favor, resulting in sickness, military defeat, a failed harvest, or even death. This is why the Tohunga Tamoko we remember had to feed the chief through a funnel. The chief's head was so tapu that to touch it with mundane food, or with his own tapu-contaminated hands, would shatter the ritual and invite catastrophe. This was the same reason the carvers of the Ware Wakairo could not have food brought near their work. The sacred ancestral wood was tapu, and the carvers themselves were in a tapu state. The balancing force to tapu was Noa. Noa means common, ordinary, profane, or unrestricted. It was the mundane state of everyday life, of cooking, of casual conversation, of all things not directly engaged with the divine. Life was a constant, careful negotiation between these two poles. Noah was also the agent used to neutralize tapu, to make a person or a place safe again. Cooked food, being the very essence of Noah, was the most powerful agent for this. After a taua returned from war, its warriors, still deeply tapu and dangerous to their own community, would undergo a ritual of wakanoa to make noa, which almost always involved a ritual feast. By consuming the noa food, their tapu state was lifted and they could safely rejoin their families. Water, and in certain ritual contexts, the female element, as the source of human life and noa, also had this power, used to lift the tapu from a newly carved house, allowing it to become a place of human occupation. If tapu was the set of laws governing divine power, then mana was the possession and expression of that power. This is the second great concept, often translated as prestige, authority, or charisma, but it is all these things and more. Mana was a person's spiritual efficacy, their proven ability to act successfully in the world, a direct reflection of the favor of the gods. Mana and tapu were inextricably linked. A person of high tapu, like a chief, was born with mana ariki, an ancestral, inherited potential for greatness. But this mana was not static. It was a living force that had to be maintained, nurtured, and above all, demonstrated. A rangatira increased his mana tangata, or mana acquired through action, by being a wise leader, a provider who oversaw abundant harvests from the Kumara gardens, a successful diplomat who forged strong alliances, and a brave warrior who successfully exacted utu and defended the pa. His mana was visible in the prosperity and strength of his hapu. Conversely, mana could be lost. A leader who failed in battle, whose pa was overrun, or most terribly, who suffered an insult or a loss and did not seek utu, had his mana damaged, perhaps irretrievably. His hapu would see this failure as a sign that the gods had turned away, and his authority would collapse. A taurekareka, the slave, was a person whose mana had been completely and totally extinguished. Finally, the third, most subtle force was Maori. Maori is the life force, the physical and spiritual essence that animates all things. It is the spark of life, the binding energy that holds the world together. Humans had a Maori, but so did the forest, Maori o te wao, the kumara crop, the pa itself, and the entire hapu as a collective. The Maori was the intrinsic health and vitality of a thing, and it was the object that tapu was designed to protect. If the Maori of the forest was damaged by disrespectful acts, like felling a tree without the proper karakia to tame mahuta, its life force would diminish, and the birds would no longer flourish there. If the Maori of a person was damaged, they would sicken. To protect this vital essence, Tohunga would often create a physical anchor for the Maori of a place, a special, hidden stone, a watu Maori, which they would bury at the base of a new pios or in a new garden, a sacred talisman to bind the life force to the land and ensure its continued prosperity. These three forces, tapu as the sacred law, mana as the sacred power, and Maori as the sacred life force, were the invisible threads that wove the Maori world together, turning the landscape of Aotearoa from a mere physical place into a living, breathing, and divinely charged entity. The world governed by tapu, mana, and Maori was a complete, self-contained, and spiritually resonant universe. It was a cosmos where the land was the body of the Earth Mother, the sky was the distant Father, and the winds were the angry breath of a grieving God. Every event, from a successful harvest to a sudden sickness, could be understood within this complex, divine framework. The wakapapa of the people connected them to this order, and the mana of the rangatira was the proof of its proper maintenance. This world, forged in the isolation of the South Pacific, was internally coherent, spiritually satisfying, and absolute. It had no concept of an outside, no category for an other that did not spring from the lineage of Rangi and Papa or from the ancestral homeland of Hawaii. And so, on a summer day in 1642, when a new and impossible shape appeared on the western horizon, it was not merely a surprise. It was a cosmological crisis, a rent in the very fabric of reality. In the 13th day of December, 1642, lookouts from the hapu of Ngati Tumatakokiri in the lands at the northern tip of the South Island would have seen the impossible. Two islands, or structures so large they defied the category of waka, were moving across the water without the rhythmic flash of paddles. They were impossibly tall, with bare, leafless trees, masts, rising from their centers, from which vast, pale leaves, sails hung, bellied in the wind. These were the Heemskerk and the Zeehan, two ships of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, commanded by the experienced and ambitious navigator, Abel Janzoon Tasman. Tasman was not looking for Aotearoa. He was on a great, sweeping voyage from Batavia, modern Indonesia, in search of the mythical Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a vast continent that European cartographers believed must exist in the south to balance the land masses of the north. He had just charted a portion of the coast of what he called Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, and now, sailing east, he had become the first European to sight this new, mountainous coastline, which he, believing it was the western edge of that great continent, named Staten Land. Tasman steered his ships into the wide, sheltered bay that now bears the name Golden Bay. As the great ships dropped their anchors, the local Maori were confronted with a profound anomaly. What were these beings? Were they Taniwha, water monsters? Were they Atua, gods from a foreign pantheon? Or were they perhaps spirits of the dead returning from the sea? The question of their tapu state was the most urgent. Were they tapu or Noah? Were they dangerous or benign? The response was immediate and ritualistically correct. They investigated. Several waka were launched from the shore, paddling with a cautious speed toward the two floating pau. The warriors in the canoes, their patu and mirror at the ready, observed the strange, pale-skinned, strangely dressed figures moving on the decks. In the gathering dusk, the Maori crews raised their putatara, the conch shell trumpets, and blew a series of loud, challenging, and ritualistic blasts, a sound designed to announce their presence, assert their mana, and test the intentions of the intruders. Here, the first tragic misunderstanding occurred, a collision of two worlds that had no shared language, no shared protocol. Tasman, a European sailor, heard the loud horns, and as he recorded in his journal, instructed his own trumpeters to respond, in order to show that we were kindly disposed. The Dutch sailors blew their own trumpets, the sound blaring across the water in a discordant reply. To the Dutch, this was a greeting, an attempt at a hail. To the warriors of Ngati Tumatakokiri, this was a disaster of protocol. They had issued a formal, ritual challenge, a query as to the visitor's take or purpose. The response they received was not a recognized reply, not a gesture of peace or a statement of lineage. It was a loud, meaningless, and therefore deeply insulting noise, a competing blast that was, in all likelihood, interpreted as an immediate and arrogant counter-challenge, a breach of the tapu of the encounter. The waka retreated to the shore in the darkness, the mana of the Hapu now deeply offended, the intruders having proven themselves to be chaotic, disrespectful, and therefore dangerous. The next morning, December 19th, the bay was still. Several waka came out again, this time with peaceful intent, or perhaps with a desire to trade. But the tapu was already broken. Tasman, wishing to confer with his second-in-command on the Zeeheim, sent a small cockboat, a ship's jolly, with 7 sailors to row between the 2 vessels. As this small, vulnerable boat passed through the open water, one of the waka, with 13 warriors aboard, suddenly surged forward, its prow striking the cockboat with immense force, throwing the sailors into confusion. In a moment, the warriors, ancestors of Tumatawenga, the god of war, were upon them. The encounter was swift, brutal, and personal. The Dutch sailors, armed only with oars, were no match for the Toas wielding their heavy stone and bone clubs. 4 of Tasman's men were killed. The warriors seized one of the bodies, hauled it into their waka, and holding the others back with their spears, they paddled for the shore with astonishing speed, retreating with their prize. Tasman was in shock. He ordered his men to fire their muskets, and then their cannons, the boom of the artillery rolling across the hills, a sound of thunder that had never been heard in this land. The shots were fruitless. The waka were too fast. To Tasman, this was an unprovoked, detestable act of savagery, a murderous assault by barbarians. He saw no reason for it, no logic. But from the Maori perspective, the logic was likely cold and clear. The utu had been exacted. These strange, pale beings had breached the tapu of the bay. They had insulted the mana of the hapu with their trumpet call, and now the balance had been restored through the shedding of blood. The taking of the body was the final act, the ultimate confirmation of the victory. Tasman, horrified and fearing his ships would be boarded by a great fleet of these treacherous people, hastily weighed anchor. He named the place Moordnayers Bay, Murderers' Bay. He sailed north, naming the 3 Kings Islands, but never again attempting to land, and then he departed eastwards, leaving Aotearoa behind. The contact, the first in history, had lasted less than a week and had been a complete and utter catastrophe. But its result was that Aotearoa, now a dark line on a distant Dutch map, was left to itself, undisturbed by the European world, for another 127 years, a silence that allowed the classic Maori world to continue its own powerful, isolated destiny. The silence that fell after Tasman's cannons faded from the coast of Murderers' Bay was a deep and profound one, a 127-year-long exhalation. The impossible visitors had come, had been proven hostile and chaotic, and having been repulsed through the ritual of Utu, they had vanished as quickly as they appeared. The PA on the headlands continued their watch. The cycles of harvest and warfare turned. The Wakapapa was lengthened by new generations, and the encounter with the Heemskerk and Zeeheim slowly retio into the realm of the strange, a story told by the fire, a bizarre chapter in the oral history of Neati Tumatakokiri. The classic Maori world remained for this long, final interlude, complete in its isolation, its tapu intact. But the world beyond the horizon had not forgotten. Tasman's Staten Land remained a tantalizing, jagged line on the charts of the Dutch, a mystery that the new rising power of the British Admiralty, driven by a post-Enlightenment hunger for science and imperial expansion, was determined to solve. On the 6th of October, 1769, a boy named Nicholas Young, the surgeon's boy perched high in the rigging of the HMB Endeavour, a refitted coal bark commanded by Lieutenant James Cook, cried out that he saw land. Cook, a navigator of genius, a product of the Royal Society as much as the Royal Navy, was on a mission of breathtaking scope. His first public objective was to sail to Tahiti to observe the rare astronomical event of the transit of Venus, a measurement that would help calculate the very size of the solar system. But his second, secret set of orders, sealed until he left Tahiti, was to sail south and west to finally locate and claim the great mythical southern continent. He had sailed from Tahiti, and with him he carried a passenger who would prove to be more valuable than any piece of scientific equipment. This was Tupaia, a high priest, Tohunga, navigator, and statesman from the island of Raiatea, the very heartland of Hawaii, a man who had lost his own lands in a war and had astutely attached himself to Cook's expedition. Tupaia was a living library of Polynesian knowledge, a speaker of the language from which all others, including Maori, had diverged. The Endeavour made landfall at a wide bay on the eastern coast of the North Island, a place Cook would eventually name Poverty Bay, because, as he noted with frustration, it afforded us no one thing we wanted. For the local Maori, the people of Rongo Hakata and Te Aitanga Ahawiti, this arrival was a repeat of the cosmological shock of 1642, but this time the waka from the sea was far larger, and it stayed. The first encounter was, once again, a tragedy born of incomprehension. When Cook, the naturalist Joseph Banks, and a party of Marines went ashore, they were met by 4 local men. An attempt at communication was made, but the cultural gulf was absolute. Tupaia called out to them from the boat, and to the astonishment of both sides, his high-status Tahitian was largely intelligible to the Maori. A flicker of understanding, the first in history, had occurred. But the moment was too tense. The Maori, seeing these strange pale beings, their weapons muskets, utterly alien, acted according to their own protocols. They performed a ritual challenge, a show of their mana and their claim to the land. Cook, misunderstanding this as pure aggression, ordered a musket fired. One of the men, Te Maro, was shot and killed. The next day, the tragedy compounded. Another group of Maori were encountered, and Tupaia, acting as the crucial intermediary, spoke with them, establishing the first real dialogue. But a scuffle broke out, perhaps over the trading of a crayfish, perhaps a perceived insult, and Cook's party, feeling threatened, opened fire again. Several more Maori were killed, including the Rangatira Te Rakau. Cook was deeply distressed by this. He was not a conqueror in the vein of Cortes. He was a man of the Enlightenment, under orders to conciliate the natives and to claim land only with their consent. But in these first disastrous days, his attempt at contact had been written in blood, the utu for his arrival already claimed by the local hapu. It was only through the tireless, patient diplomacy of Tupaia, who could finally explain the visitors' intentions, who could speak of their shared ancestral origins in Hawaii, and who could trade in a language both sides understood, that a fragile, wary peace was established. Tupaia was the bridge, the cultural Rosetta Stone that Tasman had so fatally lacked. He was able to explain the concept of tapu to Cook, and to explain Cook's strange tapu, his insistence on raising a flag, his strange rituals of mapping to the Maori. With this uneasy truce established, Cook began his true work. He was, above all, a cartographer. He proceeded to circumnavigate the entire landmass, an obsessive 6-month feat of unparalleled navigational skill. With quadrant, chronometer, and log, he charted the coastline with a precision that is still astonishing, his maps remaining the standard for decades. He sailed north, around the tip of the North Island, which he named, and then south down the east coast. He passed through the strait that now bears his name, the turbulent passage between the two great islands, proving definitively that this land was not the coast of a vast continent, but two very large, separate islands. He then charted the entire rugged coastline of the South Island to Waipunamu, sailing south along the spine of the Southern Alps around the remote fjords, before turning north again to complete his circumnavigation at the very strait he had discovered. This voyage was not just a mapping mission, it was a floating scientific expedition. Joseph Banks, the wealthy, brilliant, and insatiably curious botanist, led a team that collected thousands of specimens of plants and animals unknown to European science, the living bounty of an ecosystem that had evolved in 80 million year isolation. The artists Sidney Parkinson and Herman Spearing sketched the PA on their headlands, the intricate moko on the faces of the rangatira, the carved waka, and the shape of the mere and teaha. The journals of Cook and Banks became a priceless, detailed ethnographic record of the classic Maori world, captured at the very last moment of its isolation. They recorded the hierarchy of chief, commoner, and taurekareka. They described the great fortified pa, which Banks, a man of his time, compared to the hill forts of ancient Britain, and they noted the central importance of utu and the constant visible evidence of warfare. These were not the noble savages of Rousseau's imagination. They were, in Cook's estimation, a brave and warlike people, intelligent, proud, and fiercely protective of their mana. The interactions were a complex mixture of wonder, trade, and sharp, sudden violence, but thanks to Tupaya, a genuine, if wary, relationship was formed. When Cook finally departed in March 1770, he left behind him not only a few European goods, but a map. He had placed Aotearoa firmly and irrevocably on the chart of the world. The 127-year silence was over. The isolation that had forged this unique culture was broken, and the ships of the outside world now knew, with precise, charted certainty, exactly where to find the land of the long white cloud. The maps that Cook had so meticulously drawn were not just a scientific curiosity for the admirals in London, they were a commercial treasure map, and the ink was barely dry before the first ships, following in the Endeavour's wake, began to arrive. These new visitors, however, were not the disciplined, science-minded crews of the Royal Navy. They were the rough, pragmatic, and often brutal vanguard of global capitalism. They were the sealers and the whalers, and they came not for knowledge, but for profit, drawn by the undiscovered resources that Cook and Banks had so diligently noted in their journals. This was the first wave of sustained European contact, an unregulated, chaotic, and revolutionary intrusion that would introduce new, unimaginable tools and new, catastrophic costs, irrevocably altering the balance of the Maori world. The first to arrive in force were the sealers, rough men from Britain, America, and the Australian penal colony of New South Wales. They descended upon the southern coast of Te Waipunamu, the South Island, a cold, rugged, and sparsely populated land that was the territory of the Ngai Tahu. Cook's journals had spoken of the vast colonies of fur seals, kekano, that thronged the rocky coastlines and remote offshore islands. For southern Maori, the seal was a vital traditional resource, a source of meat, of thick, warm pelts for cloaks, and of oil. For the European traders, the pelt was a luxury commodity, a soft gold demanded by the markets of China and Europe. From the 1790s onwards, gangs of sealers were dropped on the desolate, windswept shores, living in squalid, temporary camps, their lives a cycle of brutal, bloody work. The hunt was a simple, wasteful slaughter. The seals, ecologically naive like the moa before them, were clubbed to death on their breeding grounds, their valuable skins stripped, and their carcasses left to rot on the beaches. The ecological impact was, once again, catastrophic. Within 3 decades, the mainland seal colonies were virtually exterminated, destroying a cornerstone of the Ngai Tahu economy. Simultaneously, the great deep ocean whaling ships, American Nantucketers, British, and French, began to use the northern coastline of Aotearoa as a crucial port of call. Their prey was the sperm whale and the southern right whale, hunted in the grounds of the South Pacific. But these vast, ocean-going factories needed a place to rest, repair, and restock. The perfect anchorage, as Cook had noted, was the Bay of Islands, Waitangi, in the heart of Ngapuhi territory. This beautiful, sheltered bay became the Pacific's most notorious refreshment stop. The whalers would anchor for weeks at a time, their crews, released from the long, harsh discipline of the sea, descending on the shore in search of 3 things: fresh food, water, and women. A new, frenetic, and dangerous economy was born. This was the nexus of the trade. The rangatira of the Bay of Islands, men of the powerful Ngapuhi iwi, were astute, quick to recognize the opportunity. They controlled the supply of the kumara, the pigs, which had been introduced by Cook and now ran wild, and the timber the whalers needed for spars and repairs. But more importantly, they controlled the supply of harakeke, the flax. The flax fibers, the muka we remember from the weaver's hands, were discovered by the Europeans to be superior to hemp for making rope, cordage, and sail canvas. A global demand for flax boomed. Maori, particularly women, and taurakaraka, slaves, were put to the laborious work of scraping and preparing tons of this fiber. In exchange, the Maori sought not trinkets, but technology. The first, most revolutionary items were simple pieces of iron. A single iron nail could be beaten flat and sharpened into a fishing lure that was 10 times more durable than one of bone. An iron axe head, a toki, was a tool of such profound power that it could do the work of 10 men using stone adzes, making the felling of a totara for a waka or a ware a matter of days, not months. Iron became the new pounamu, the new standard of wealth. But this trade centered in the lawless, chaotic beach settlement of Kororareka, modern Russell, which quickly became known as the hellhole of the Pacific, had a devastating, unseen cost. With the sailors came their diseases. The Maori, having lived in 800 years of complete isolation, had no immunity, no ancestral memory of the crowd diseases of Europe. Measles, influenza, and dysentery, which were survivable sicknesses for the whalers, became virgin soil epidemics for Maori, sweeping through the Pe'ā with the speed and lethality of a taua. A cough or a fever could annihilate an entire hapu in a matter of weeks, a silent, invisible killer that defied all karakia of the Tohunga and shattered the Maori of the people. Venereal diseases also arrived, spreading rapidly through the new, tragic trade of prostitution on the beaches of Kororareka, undermining the fertility of generations of women. And then came the final, fatal commodity. While an axe transformed the economy, one item transformed the very nature of mana and utu. This was the pew, the musket. At first, the whalers were reluctant to trade their firearms, but by the 1810s, the trade was open. A chief who possessed muskets had an absolute, terrifying, and decisive advantage over a rival who did not. The Pe'e, those brilliant earthwork fortresses designed to repel warriors with spears and clubs, were suddenly obsolete against an enemy who could kill from a distance. The traditional ritualized nature of warfare, the personal combat of the Toa with his mir, was rendered tragically irrelevant. The mana of a rangatira now depended entirely on his ability to acquire this new, thunderous weapon. A desperate, frantic, and all-consuming arms race began. The only way to get muskets was to trade, and the only things of value to trade were flax, timber, and preserved tattooed human heads, mokomokai, a grotesque new market that fueled the warfare. The tribes of the Bay of Islands, the Ngapuhi, had first access. They began to stockpile the pew, and one of their rangatira, a man of brilliant strategic vision and ruthless ambition, was about to use this newfound power to redraw the map of Aotearoa in blood. The pew, the musket, was now the new god of war, a god that had arrived on the decks of the whalers and had been eagerly welcomed into the pantheon. The mana of Tumatawenga, the ancestral deity of warfare, was now channeled not through the sacred Ponamu Mir or the hand-to-hand bravery of the Toa, but through the thunderous, impersonal, and terrifyingly efficient explosion of gunpowder. The balance of power, which for centuries had been a delicate equilibrium of hapu against hapu, fortress against fortress, was now irrevocably broken, and the iwi that held the key to this new, terrible power was Ngapuhi, who controlled the Bay of Islands, the very gateway of the trade. And at the head of Ngapuhi was a rangatira of singular genius, ruthless ambition, and a truly global perspective. His name was Hongi Hika. Hongi was a complex man, a warrior raised in the old world of Utu and Tapu, but also a brilliant and astute political realist who saw, faster than any of his contemporaries, that the world had changed forever. He was not a savage dazzled by European trinkets. He was a statesman who actively patronized the first missionaries, such as Thomas Kendall, not out of any deep desire to convert to Christianity, but because he saw them as a strategic asset. They were a bridge to the European world, a source of knowledge, and most importantly, a source of the iron tools and literacy that he craved for his people. He understood that to survive in this new era, he must master the tools of the Pakeha, the white stranger. In 1820, he took the most audacious step of his career. He traveled with Kendall all the way to England, the very heart of the power that was now projecting itself into his world. This journey was a masterpiece of political theater and strategic planning. In England, Hongi Hika was not treated as a mere curiosity. He was presented to King George IV, a meeting of two sovereigns, one of a global empire, the other of a powerful iruwi at the edge of the world. He was a sensation, intelligent, dignified, his face bearing the magnificent, grooved lines of his moko. The king, impressed by this warrior chief, presented him with a full suit of shining plate armor, a gift of immense symbolic and practical value. Hongi studied the British military, its organization, its armories at the Tower of London, absorbing the logistics of this new kind of warfare. He assisted the Cambridge scholar Samuel Lee in compiling the first comprehensive dictionary and grammar of the Maori language, a monumental intellectual achievement that would ironically later aid the very missionaries he was using. But all this, the royal meetings, the academic work, the gifts of armor, was merely a means to an end. The true deadly purpose of his journey was revealed on his return voyage. In 1821, Hongi stopped in Sydney, the rough port of the Australian colony. There, he systematically traded away the valuable ceremonial gifts he had received in England, all save his suit of armor. He did not trade them for plows, or blankets, or Bibles. He traded them for an arsenal. He acquired an estimated 500 muskets, along with a massive quantity of gunpowder, lead, and flints, and loaded them onto his ship. When he arrived back in the Bay of Islands, he was not just a rangatira who had shaken the hand of a distant king. He was the commander of the most powerful, technologically advanced army in the history of Aotearoa. His mana was now supreme, and his take, his cause, was deep. For generations, Ngapuhi had suffered insults and defeats at the hands of their southern neighbors, the iwi of the Tamaki Isthmus and the Hauraki Gulf. The ledger of Utu was long, and Hongi Hika, now invulnerable in his British armor, his warriors armed with the pew, was ready to settle the account. The era that followed is known as the Musket Wars, or the Nga Putoka. It was not warfare, as it had been known. It was a blitzkrieg. In late 1821, Hongi assembled a vast tawa, a war party of perhaps 2,000 Ngapuhi warriors, bristling with muskets, who paddled south in their great fleet of waka tawa. Their target was the Ngati Pawa people on the Tamaki Isthmus at their great pa on the banks of the Tamaki River. The defenders, armed primarily with taiaha and mir, were horrified to see this army approaching, but they retreated to their traditional defenses, the ditches and palisades that had protected them for centuries. The battle was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Ngapuhi warriors did not attempt to storm the gates. They simply sat just outside the range of the defenders' thrown spears and began a systematic rolling fire, shooting the to'o as they appeared on the ramparts. The pia, a masterpiece of pre-gunpowder engineering, was now a death trap. In a panic, the defenders broke and fled, only to be cut down by the musket fire. This was only the beginning. The tawa moved on, a tide of fire and smoke, to the great Ngati Maru stronghold of Te Totara in the Thames estuary. Here, the defenders were wary, and Hongi, showing his mastery of both old and new tactics, feigned a withdrawal, lulling the PA into a false sense of security. His warriors then returned under the cover of night, swarmed the palisades, and the muskets did their terrible work in the pre-dawn light. The pa fell, and the slaughter was immense. This was Utu on an industrial scale, warfare transformed by technology into a tool of demographic catastrophe. The survivors were captured, becoming taurekareka, who were then forced to carry the plundered goods and the smoked heads of their own relatives back to the Bay of Islands. These slaves were then put to work scraping flax to be traded for more muskets to fuel the next campaign. Hongi Hika had created a terrifying, self-perpetuating engine of war. This single campaign shattered the power of the Tamaki and Hauraki tribes, sending thousands of refugees fleeing south, an exodus that would destabilize the entire North Island, as these refugees, desperate and displaced, were forced to fight the tribes whose lands they were now crossing. The musket wars had begun, and the only possible response for survival was to acquire the PU at any cost. Hongi Hika's devastating campaigns, fueled by his Sydney arsenal, were not a singular event. They were the first terrible domino to fall, initiating a cascade of violence that would consume the entire archipelago for nearly 2 decades. The Taua from Ngapuhi did not just defeat their enemies, they displaced them, sending a great shockwave of refugees, the Heke, fleeing southwards, who in turn became invaders, desperate for new lands and, above all, for their own access to the Pū. The map of Aotearoa, which had been a stable mosaic of iwi territories for centuries, was about to be entirely and violently redrawn by fire. The old world of the classic PA was gone, and a new, brutal arms race had begun, where the only options were to acquire the musket, to flee, or to perish. The most potent and tragic example of this ripple effect was personified by another military and political genius, a contemporary of Hongi's from the south, Te Rauparaha, the rangatira of the Ngāti Toa Iwi. Ngāti Toa's homeland was at Kauai, on the west coast of the North Island, but they were now caught in a terrible strategic vice. To their north, the Waikato tribes, themselves under pressure from Hongi's Ngapuhi, were rapidly arming themselves. To their south, the troops of Taranaki were doing the same. Te Rauparaha, a man of immense mana and foresight, realized his people could no longer hold their ancestral lands. In 1822, in a remarkable and desperate act of national survival, he led his entire iwi, men, women, and children, numbering in the thousands, on a great migration, a heke, southwards. This was Te Heka Tataramoa, the migration of the bramble bush, so named because their path, like the bramble, was one of scratching, tearing, and fighting for every mile of passage through the hostile territories of other tribes. Te Rauparaha fought his way down the coast, a mobile, land-based taua, until he reached the Cook Strait. There, he identified a fortress that was the key to the new economy, Kapiti Island. Kapiti was a superb natural paw, its cliffs easily defensible, and it sat directly astride the new maritime highway. Whaling ships, which had previously frequented the Bay of Islands, were now anchoring there to trade. Te Rauparaha seized the island, dispossessing the local tribes, and from this stronghold he began his own campaign of terror and trade, turning Kapiti into the Bay of Islands of the South. He now controlled the flax and kumara trade for the entire region, and he began to purchase his own arsenal of muskets. He had, in effect, become the new Hongi, and his gaze now turned south, across the strait, to the vast, rich, and as yet largely unarmed lands of Te Waipunamu, the South Island, the territory of Ngāi Tahu. This pattern repeated itself across the land. The arms race was all-consuming. Iwi, who had no access to a trading port, were forced into desperate measures. They would launch taua simply to capture a valuable resource, a stand of flax, or a rival's kumara stores, which they could then trade. The most grotesque commodity in this new economy was the mokomokai, the preserved tattooed head. The moko, we remember, as a sacred visual wakapapa was now, to the traders in Sydney and London, a macabre curiosity, a collector's item. This created a horrifying incentive. Taua were launched for the express purpose of killing men with fine moko to harvest their heads, which were then traded for the muskets needed to launch the next taua. In a desperate, tragic irony, sometimes tarekareka, slaves, would be tattooed with meaningless patterns and then killed, their heads preserved and sold, all to feed the insatiable hunger for the poo. As the musket became ubiquitous, the very architecture of war changed. The high, dramatic hill forts of the classic period, those pa on the volcanic cones, were now suicidal. They were exposed, perfect targets for an enemy with ranged weapons. A new generation of military engineers arose, and a new, more deadly fortress was invented, the gunfighter pa, or pa-pu. These were masterpieces of adaptation. They were often built on low, swampy, or forested ground where visibility was poor and a direct assault was difficult. They abandoned the old high ramparts for a complex system of deep, narrow rifle trenches, often in a zigzag pattern to prevent an enfilading fire. They built anti-artillery bunkers, ruapu, covered with thick layers of earth and timber, where the non-combatants could shelter from the musket balls. The outer palisade, the tawada, was no longer a single rigid wall, but was often a double fence, the space between them packed with loose bundles of flax, a form of soft, resilient armor designed not to shatter under fire, but to absorb the impact of the lead balls. It was a brilliant, indigenous response to a foreign technology, a sign of the undiminished military genius of the Maori. But this new warfare was devastating. Te Rauparaha, now fully armed, unleashed his own campaigns against Ngai Tahu. In 1831, in a particularly infamous act, he concealed his warriors on board the British trading brig Elizabeth, whose captain, John Stewart, he had paid in flax. The brig anchored at Akaroa, and the local Ngai Tahu rangatira, Te Maiharanui, was lured on board to trade, believing it to be a neutral vessel. He was seized along with his wife and daughter. Te Rauparaha's warriors, hidden below decks, then stormed ashore and sacked the unsuspecting pa. Te Maiharanui and his family were taken back to Kapiti and killed, a terrible payment of utu. The following year, Te Rauparaha laid siege to the great Ngai Tahu pa at Kaiapoi, near modern Christchurch. This was a pa-pu, and it held out for 3 months, but the attackers, using fire, eventually breached the defenses. The pia fell, and the slaughter was catastrophic, breaking the back of Ngai Tahu power in the region. The musket wars finally burned themselves out in the late 1830s, not with a peace treaty, but from a combination of mutual exhaustion and technological parity. By around 1837, the musket was everywhere. The technological advantage that Hongihika had first enjoyed was gone. When fully armed taua met, the battles were now terrifyingly costly for both sides, often ending in a bloody stalemate. The cost in human life had been staggering. Historians estimate that in this period, at least 20,000 Maori were killed in battle, with perhaps twice that number enslaved or displaced, out of a total population of maybe 100,000. It was a demographic cataclysm, a holocaust as some historians have termed it, that shattered iwi, broke genealogical lines, and left vast tracts of land depopulated and desolate. And it was into this traumatized, exhausted, and radically altered landscape, a land whose tribal boundaries were now defined by the musket and the refugee hakes, that a new third force was beginning to walk, a force that carried not a poo, but a book. Into the landscape of this profound trauma, this world of shattered paw, mass migrations, and the constant acrid smell of gunpowder, a new force had been walking, largely unnoticed for years, but now gaining a power it had never possessed before. This was the force of the missionary, the métairie, the agent of the Christian God. They had, in fact, been present almost as long as the whalers. The first mission had been established on Christmas Day in 1814 at Rangihua in the Bay of Islands by Samuel Marsden of the Church Missionary Society, CMS. But this first mission was by all traditional measures a profound failure. Its patron was none other than Hongi Hika himself, but as we remember, Hongi's patronage was not spiritual, it was strategic. He saw the missionaries as his personal pakeha, a captive, dependent community of artisans, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a rope maker, and a vital source of iron tools, blankets, and crucially, access to the muskets that his utu required. The missionaries of this first, desperate wave, like Thomas Kendall, found themselves in an impossible position. The Maori rangatira they lived amongst were practical, and their worldview was governed by mana. A rangatira's mana was proven by his success in this world, success in harvest, success in diplomacy, and success in war. The atua of the missionaries, this new god named Ihu Karedi, Jesus Christ, appeared to have very little mana at all. His followers, the missionaries, were poor. They were often subservient to the chiefs, and they preached a bizarre, inverted theology of wakairi, or humility, urging warriors to turn the other cheek, a concept that in a world governed by utu was not just cowardice, but a form art of spiritual and social suicide. Why, a rangatira would ask, would he abandon Tumatawenga, the god who gave him victory, for a god who had been, by his own followers' admission, captured, shamed, and executed by his enemies? The missionaries made almost no converts for over a decade, but then came the musket wars, and the ground shifted beneath everyone's feet. The devastation was not just physical, it was a spiritual cataclysm. The very system of tapu, mana, and utu that had ordered the universe was now the engine of its destruction, a cycle of vengeance that was, with the pu, depopulating the land. The Karakia of the Tohunga were powerless against the invisible plagues of measles and influenza that arrived on the ships, silent killers that defied all ritual. The old gods seemed to have hidden their faces, their Māori eclipsed by the thunder of gunpowder and the weeping of the hapu. A profound spiritual vacuum had been created, a deep, collective yearning for a new mataranga, a new knowledge that could explain this chaotic, terrifying world, and perhaps offer a way to control it. It was into this void that a new generation of missionaries, led by the indefatigable Henry Williams, began to offer a new, revolutionary technology. It was not a weapon, it was the Word. The true Word of God that the missionaries brought was not, at first, the gospel. It was literacy. In the 1820s, as Hongi Hika was in England helping Professor Samuel Lee standardize the Maori alphabet, the missionaries on the ground, particularly William Williams and William Colenso, were beginning the monumental task of translating the Bible into Te Reo Maori. They established mission schools, and the Maori response was not a slow trickle, but a sudden explosive flood. The rangatira, who had once demanded axes and muskets, now demanded books and slates. The reason was clear. Maori society, though possessing no written script, was one of the most literate cultures on earth in the sense of its profound reverence for language, memory, and the power of the preserved word. The Wakapapa and Karakia, memorized with perfect precision by the Tohunga over generations, were the tapu foundation of their world. They immediately recognized writing as a new, astonishingly powerful, and permanent form of Wakapapa. A literacy craze swept the North Island in the 1830s. Writing was seen as a new kind of mana, a Pakeha magic for fixing the voice. A message could now be sent via a runner, carried on a piece of paper, and it would speak with the exact mana of the sender, an unbelievable advantage in diplomacy and war. And the book they were given to read, the Paipara Tapu, the Holy Bible, was not a gentle collection of parables. It was, especially the Old Testament, a text that resonated deeply with the Maori worldview. It was full of genealogies, the Bagats, tribal warfare, heroic toa, prophets who spoke with God, Tohunga, and a powerful, jealous, and warlike deity who demanded tepu and enacted utu upon his enemies. This was a God they could understand. The most effective missionaries were not the Pakeha at all, but Maori themselves. As the musket wars concluded, many Taurekareka slaves who had been captured by Ngaapuhi and had learned to read and write in the mission schools of the Bay of Islands were freed. They began to make their way back to their ancestral lands, often hundreds of miles away, and they carried with them this new, potent knowledge. Men like Wiremu Tamihana in the Waikato or Ripahau in the south became evangelists to their own iwi, teaching thousands to read and write under the shade of a tree long before a white missionary had ever visited. The conversion to Christianity was, for many, a syncretic and pragmatic act. It was the adoption of a new, powerful Karakia and a new Atua, whose book-based mana seemed to offer a path out of the chaos. By 1840, a significant portion of the Maori population, perhaps half, identified in some way as Christian. This shared faith began to act as a peacemaking tool, a new set of principles that could for the first time break the unbreakable cycle of utu. The missionaries, particularly Henry Williams, who was fluent in Te Reo and respected for his courage, became the primary intermediaries, the trusted advisors to the very rangatira, who were now looking for a permanent solution to the lawlessness of the whalers, the rum sellers, and the new aggressive land buyers of the New Zealand Company, who were beginning to arrive in their ships. The stage was now set for the most important and most contested document in Aotearoa's history. The musket wars had finally guttered out, leaving the land in a state of exhausted, fragile paralysis, a world shattered and remade by the PU. The old tapu had been proven defenseless against the new diseases, and the old mana of the Teoe had been eclipsed by the impersonal power of gunpowder. It was into this spiritual and political vacuum that the missionaries, with their new god and their potent magic of literacy, had walked. But they were not alone. Close behind them came a new, more secular, and far more dangerous wave of Pakeha, the land speculators. The most formidable of these was the New Zealand Company, an ambitious private corporation in London, led by the systematic theorist of colonization, Edward Gibbon Wakefield. They were not interested in souls. They were interested in land, and they began sending ships packed with settlers to Aotearoa, armed with deeds of purchase for vast tracts of land, often bought from dubious or absent sellers for a pittance of blankets, axes, and beads. The Maori rangatira, the survivors of the wars, were now caught in a new, impossible vice. On one side was the lawlessness of the whalers and rum sellers, who debased their kainga villages and flouted their mana. On the other was the creeping, legalistic threat of the company, which was attempting to buy the very ground from beneath their feet. The missionaries, particularly Henry Williams, who had become a trusted advisor to many northern chiefs, offered a third path. They spoke of a powerful, distant, and seemingly benevolent sovereign, a queen in England, who was the head of their own iwi, and who, if petitioned, might send a representative, a kawana or governor, to control her own unruly people and to protect the mana and the property of the Maori chiefs. For rangatira desperate to restore order and protect their turanga waiwai, their standing place, this idea of a royal protector, a mana from overseas to balance the Pekaha chaos, became an increasingly appealing proposition. The British government, for its part, had long been reluctant to intervene. Establishing a new colony was expensive, complex, and fraught with moral and political difficulty. But the aggressive, unilateral actions of the New Zealand Company, which was now landing settlers in Port Nicholson, modern Wellington, and claiming millions of acres, forced its hand. If Britain did not act, New Zealand would be colonized anyway, but in a chaotic, unjust, and violent manner. Added to this was the persistent, nagging fear that if Britain did not claim Aotearoa, its old rival France might. The Colonial Office in London finally relented. In 1839, it dispatched a Royal Navy captain, William Hobson, with the title of consul and a set of instructions from the colonial secretary, Lord Normanby. Hobson's mission was clear and, in the context of the time, remarkably liberal. He was to secure British sovereignty over New Zealand, but he was explicitly forbidden from doing so by force. He could only proceed with the free and intelligent consent of the natives, a condition that made his entire mission dependent on an act of diplomacy, on a formal, negotiated agreement. Hobson, a stern naval officer already suffering from the ill health that would soon kill him, arrived in the Bay of Islands in January 1840. He landed in the heart of the hellhole of the Pacific, Kororareka, and immediately sought out the two men he needed most, James Busby, the official British resident, and the missionary Henry Williams, the man who held the trust of the Ngapuhi chiefs. Time was critical. The New Zealand Company settlers were already disembarking in the south. Hobson, Busby, and Williams hastily drafted a document, a treaty of cession. But this English draft was for the British archives. It was not the document that Maori would sign. The urgent overnight task fell to Henry Williams and his son Edward, who were fluent in Te Reo Maori. They were not lawyers or trained diplomats. They were missionaries. They sat by candlelight, translating the complex, abstract English legal concepts of sovereignty and governance into the Maori worldview, a language of mana, tapu, and utu. Their good faith translation, produced in haste, was an act of cultural approximation, and in that gap of understanding, the future of the nation would be forged and fractured. On February 5, 1840, a great hui, or assembly, was called. Hundreds of rangatira, mostly from the northern iwi, gathered in a large canvas tent erected on the sloping lawn in front of Busby's house at Waitangi. The air was thick with tension, with the mana of the gathered chiefs, their faces bearing the moko of their wakapapa. Hobson presented his document, and Henry Williams read the Maori text aloud. The debate that followed was a magnificent, passionate, and desperate display of oratory. The old world stood in confrontation with the new. Chiefs like Te Kamara of Ngarikawa and Rewa of Ngai Tawake spoke with fire, rejecting the treaty outright. They held up the land to Hobson, crying that this was their mana, their inheritance from their ancestors. They feared this kawana would be a shadow that would soon loom over them, a taniwa that would consume their authority, a paka chief who would in the end reduce them to the status of taurekareka, slaves. It seemed the hui would reject the treaty. The turning point came from two powerful Ngapuhi chiefs who had been allied with the missionaries. The first was Hone Heke, the charismatic and volatile nephew of the great Hongi Hika. He spoke of the lawlessness, the need for a new order. But the decisive speech, the one that swung the mana of the assembly, came from Tamati Waka Nene, a rangatira of immense prestige and a recent convert to Christianity. Nene did not speak to Hobson. He turned and addressed his fellow chiefs. He spoke with a quiet, forceful logic. The Pakeha are already here, he argued. The land is already gone. It is too late. He argued that the old world was finished, and that their only path to survival, their only hope for controlling the lawless settlers and predatory land sharks, was to accept the kawana as a partner, a father, and a protector, a single powerful rangatira from the queen who could bring the pakeha to heel. His speech, his mana, carried the day. The next morning, February 6th, 1840, the chiefs reassembled. Hone Heke was the first rangatira to step forward and place his tohu, his unique personal mark, upon the document. More than 40 others followed him. This was the Treaty of Waitangi, a covenant, a sacred compact, which was then copied and carried by missionaries and officers around the country, from the Waikato to the South Island, to gather the tohu of over 500 rangatira. Hobson, in a rush, proclaimed British sovereignty. The rangatira believed they had gained a powerful protector of their mana and their lands. The British believed they had just been given a new country. The profound and perhaps fatal ambiguity at the document's heart had not yet been discovered. That profound and fatal ambiguity, resting in the ink of the treaty drafts, was not a simple error of translation. It was a chasm between two worlds, a void between two incompatible concepts of power, law, and land. The document signed on that summer lawn at Waitangi was not one treaty, but two, a pair of texts that reflected what each side wished the other to mean. The British, represented by Hobson and the Colonial Office, believed they were enacting a tidy, standard, and absolute transfer of power. Their English text, the one that would be filed in the archives of a global empire, was to their minds unequivocal. Article the First stated that the assembled chiefs did cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England absolutely and without reservation all the rights and powers of sovereignty which they held over their lands. This was, for the British, the entire point. It was the legal mechanism by which Aotearoa became British the moment the mana of the Queen eclipsed all others, making her the sole source of law and authority in the land. Article the second of this English text was intended as the Great Concession. It confirmed and guaranteed to the chiefs the full exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties. This was the promise of protection for their property, but it contained a sting, a crucial mechanism for colonization. It also yielded to the Queen the exclusive right of preemption over any lands the Maori might wish to sell. This meant the Crown, and only the Crown, could be the purchaser. This was Wakefield's idea, a policy intended to stop the New Zealand Company from buying land directly and to ensure the government controlled the pace and price of settlement. Article the Third was a simple, liberal promise. In return for this cession, the Queen extended to all Maori her royal protection and imparted to them all the rights and privileges of British subjects. In the mind of William Hobson, the transaction was complete. Sovereignty had been exchanged for protection, and the way was now clear for an orderly British colony. But the rangatira at Waitangi, the men who placed their sacred tohu on the parchment, had not read this English text. They had listened to Henry Williams, their trusted matarer, read aloud the Maori translation, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And in this translation, crafted by candlelight in a matter of hours, the entire meaning of the agreement was transformed by the choice of a few critical words. The first and most impossible word was sovereignty. Williams, searching for a Maori equivalent, knew one did not exist. The only word that came close to supreme authority was mana, and Williams knew with absolute certainty that no rangatira would ever, under any circumstances, cede their mana. Mana was a divine inheritance, the legacy of the atua, the very life force of the hapu. To cede it was to become a taurakareka, a slave. It was unthinkable. So Williams made a fateful choice. He reached for a neologism, a word that Maori had invented from English, kawanatanga. This word was derived from kawana, the Maori transliteration of governor. Kawanatanga therefore meant governance or governorship. To the rangatira who heard this word, it did not mean the surrender of their supreme ancestral authority. It meant exactly what Tamati Wakanene had argued for. They were granting the Queen the right to have a kawana who would exercise a limited administrative authority, a governorship primarily over the chaotic Pakeha settlers who were already causing so much strife. It was a delegation of power, not an extinguishment of their own. Then came the Maori version of Article the Second, and it is here that the chasm widens into an unbridgeable gulf. Where the English text guaranteed possession of their properties, the Maori text, Te Tiriti, offered something far more profound. It guaranteed the chiefs, the hapu, and all the people of New Zealand their tino rangatiratanga. This was not a new word. It was one of the most powerful and resonant concepts in the Maori political lexicon. Rangatiratanga was chieftainship, the authority and rights of a rangatira. The addition of tino, meaning absolute, quintessential, or unqualified, magnified this to mean the absolute and unqualified chieftainship. So, while the British believed they were receiving sovereignty in Article 1, the rangatira believed they were having their own absolute sovereignty, confirmed and guaranteed in Article 2. They believed they had signed a document that in its most important article did the very opposite of what the English text intended. It was, in their reading, a perfect deal They were getting a kawana to control the pakeha in exchange for a crown guarantee of their own Tino Rangatiratanga over their lands, Wenua, their villages, Kainga, and all their treasured possessions, Taonga Katoa, a term that implicitly included their culture, their language, and their mana. The discrepancy did not end there. The exclusive right of preemption in Article 2 was translated as hokonga, the simple word for buying or trade. The exclusive nature of this right, the fact that it created a crown monopoly, was not made clear in the Maori text, which simply stated that chiefs would sell land to the queen at a price agreed to by the person owning it and by the person buying it, the queen's agent. Most chiefs likely heard this as a right of first refusal, not a permanent binding monopoly that would prevent them from selling to others at a higher price. And so, the compact was sealed in this cloud of mutual misunderstanding. The British raised the Union Jack, believing they now owned New Zealand. The Rangatira returned to their pa, believing they had hired a powerful protector for their mana. The discovery of the truth was not a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, sickening realization that unfolded over the following months and years. Governor Hobson and his successors began to act like they had sovereignty. They began to impose taxes, to try and apply British law to Maori in disputes between Maori, and most critically, they began to rigorously enforce the Crown's monopoly on land purchase. This was the first agonizing point of friction. Rangatira who wished to sell land to the eager settlers of the New Zealand Company found themselves forbidden, forced to sell only to the Crown's agents at a fraction of the price. To them, this was a gross violation of the Tino Rangatiratanga that had been guaranteed to them. The ink was barely dry on Te Tiriti, and already to the Maori who had signed it, the kawana was breaking his word. The stage was not set for peace. It was set for the next inevitable conflict. The stage was indeed set, the actors already in their places, and the script was the two contradictory versions of the treaty, a document of peace that was now, with a terrible gathering speed, becoming the justification for war. The first agonizing point of friction, as the S. Rangatira, who had signed Te Tiriti, believing their Tino Rangatiratanga, their absolute chieftainship and control over their own affairs, was guaranteed, were now confronted by a kawana who acted as if he held the ultimate mana. And this kawana enforced the Crown's right of preemption, that monopoly on land sales that had been so unclearly translated. This policy was, in the eyes of the settlers, a frustrating bottleneck, but in the eyes of Maori, it was an intolerable, infuriating insult. It denied them their right to do as they pleased with their own taonga, their property, and it forced them to sell to a single buyer, the Crown, who offered prices that were a fraction of what the land-hungry settlers of the New Zealand Company were willing to pay. It was a direct assault on their economic and chiefly mana. The first blood was spilled not in a war, but in a lethal dispute over this very issue. It happened in 1843, just 3 years after the signing at Waitangi, in the wide, fertile Wairau Valley in the northern South Island. The New Zealand Company, that same aggressive corporation whose actions had forced Britain's hand, claimed to have purchased the valley. The local Ngati Toa chiefs, including the formidable and aging Te Rauparaha, whom we remember from his great migration, and his fiery nephew Te Rangi Hayata, flatly denied that the land had ever been sold. When the company sent a party of surveyors to begin laying out sections, Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Hayata led a group that non-violently and with great dignity escorted the surveyors off the land, carefully packing their equipment and burning their empty thatched huts. The company's local representative, Arthur Wakefield, a proud and stubborn man from the powerful Wakefield dynasty, reacted with fury. He persuaded the local magistrate, who was also a company man, to issue a warrant for the arrest of Te Rauparaha on a charge of arson. A party of 49 armed Pakeha volunteers, a civilian militia, set out from the settlement of Nelson, led by Wakefield and the magistrate, to execute this warrant upon one of the most powerful and feared rangatira in all of Aotearoa. They confronted Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Hayata on the banks of the Tua Marina stream. The mood was electric with tapu and menace. A missionary who was present tried to mediate. Te Rauparaha was calm, stating he would argue the case in a court, but he would not be handcuffed and taken like a slave. The magistrate, in a fit of panicked arrogance, insisted. A stray shot was fired. It is still a historiographic mystery as to which side it came from, and in an instant the confrontation exploded into a pitched battle. The Pakeha militia, disorganized and terrified, was quickly outflanked. They broke and fled. Wakefield and several others surrendered. But Te Rangi Hayata, discovering that his own wife, Te Rongo, had been killed in the crossfire, invoked the terrible binding law of Utu. The take was now one of blood. He moved among the captured Pakeha, and one by one he executed them with his mir. The Wairau Afre, as it became known, sent a shockwave of terror through the new settler communities. They had been defeated, their leaders killed, and they screamed for the Kawana to send troops and avenge the massacre. But the new governor, Robert Fitzroy, did the opposite. He traveled south, investigated the incident, and in a courageous and deeply unpopular decision, he declared that the Pakeha had been the aggressors, that the warrant was illegal, and that the New Zealand Company's land claim was false. He would not, he declared, take action against Te Rauparaha. To the settlers, this was a betrayal. To Maori, it was a stunning and correct affirmation of their mana and Tino Rangatiratanga. The treaty, for a brief, shining moment, had been upheld as they understood it. But this fragile balance could not last. The pressure was too great. The rangatira who had first signed the treaty, Honheke of Ngapuhi, was now the most disillusioned of all. The signing at Waitangi had for him been a disaster. The Kawana had moved the capital south to the new settlement of Auckland, and the Bay of Islands, once the center of the Pakeha universe, saw its shipping and trade evaporate. Its economy collapsed. To add insult to injury, the Kawana now imposed customs duties on the few remaining ships, a tax that Hake saw as a direct theft of his own chiefly dues. And, as the ultimate symbol of this new insulting order, a towering flagpole had been erected on the hill above the town of Kororareka, the old hellhole, which was now called Russell. From it, a foreign flag, the Union Jack, flew above his mana, above his Turanga Waiwai. Honeheke, the charismatic and brilliant warrior nephew of Hongi Hika, decided to act, not with a petition, but with a tohu, a sign, just as he had placed on the treaty. In July 1844, he and his warriors marched to the flagstaff, and in a profound act of ritualized political protest, they chopped it down. This was not vandalism. It was a precise, symbolic statement. He was not attacking the settlers, many of whom were his friends. He was attacking the Kawanatanga, the governorship, which in his eyes had violated the pact and overstepped its bounds. The British re-erected the flagstaff, sheathing its base in iron. Hake chopped it down again. They re-erected it a third time, stationing troops to guard it. In March 1845, Hake and his tawa launched a full-scale coordinated assault. While a diversionary raid was launched on the town, Hake's men took the blockhouse guarding the flagstaff, and for the fourth and final time, the symbol of the Queen's mana was felled. The Northern War had begun. The British military, the heroes of Waterloo, expected a swift victory against a native rabble. They were instead handed a series of humiliating, bloody defeats. The Maori they were fighting were not the warriors of 1769. They were the graduates of the musket wars, brilliant engineers and tacticians. Heke and his ally, the strategic genius Kawiti, had built a new generation of Piepu, the gunfighter fortresses we remember. At the Battle of Pukatutu, the British were repulsed. Then, at Ohaiwai, they staged a full Napoleonic-style frontal assault against Kawiti's Pa. They were met by a fortress with flax-padded palisades that absorbed the cannonballs and a complex network of trenches and bunkers from which the Maori warriors poured a devastating disciplined musket fire. The assault was a catastrophe. The British regiment cut to pieces, their mana shattered. The war only ended in 1846 when the British, now under the command of the aggressive new governor, George Grey, laid siege to Kawiti's final masterpiece fortress, Ruapekapeka, the Bat's Nest. This pa was so advanced, with its interconnecting tunnels and underground bunkers, that after a 2-week artillery bombardment, the British stormed it, only to find it largely empty. The Maori had slipped away through the forest, having inflicted far more casualties than they received. The war ended in an uneasy stalemate. Heke was pardoned, no land was confiscated. But the treaty's two irreconcilable meanings had now been tested in open war. It was clear that Kawanatanga and Tino Rangatiratanga could not rule the same land. The settlers, whose numbers were growing by the thousand, would not accept native authority, and their relentless, insatiable hunger for land would soon light a much larger fire. This uneasy stalemates that had ended the Northern War and the First Taranaki War were not, as the Rangatira might have hoped, a restoration of balance. They were merely a pause, a breath taken by the colonial government as it gathered its strength for a final, decisive, and overwhelming assertion of its Kawanatanga. The settler population was now growing exponentially, their hunger for land becoming a deafening political roar. They saw the Maori, particularly in the fertile heart of the North Island, as rebels and savages who were land hoarding, preventing the God-given progress of British civilization. The ambiguities of the Treaty of Waitangi, those two irreconcilable texts of Tino Rangatiratanga and sovereignty, were about to be settled not by law or diplomacy, but by canon, by the surveyor's chain, and by an act of parliament that would serve as the crown's ultimate, devastating utu. The primary target was the Waikato, the rich river plain heartland of the Tainui Confederation. This region was not just coveted for its fertile soils, It was the symbolic and political heart of the Kongitanga, the Maori king movement. The Kongitanga had been formed in the 1850s as a pan-tribal confederation, a Maori response to the growing settler threat. Its purpose was to hold on to the land, to stop the tide of sales, and to establish a parallel mana to that of the queen, not to oppose her necessarily, but to coexist, a king for Maori as she was a queen for the Pakeha. To the settlers, and to the shrewd, iron-willed governor, George Grey, who had returned for a second term, the Kongitanga was an intolerable act of rebellion, a direct, treasonous challenge to the Queen's sole sovereignty. Grey, a master of propaganda, manufactured a pretext claiming the Kingites were preparing an imminent murderous assault on the settler capital of Auckland. It was a lie, but it was the justification he needed. In July 1863, the invasion began. This was not a war in the sense of the earlier conflicts, which had been skirmishes or sieges against individual PI. This was a full-scale modern invasion, a total war aimed at the utter subjugation of an entire people. General Duncan Cameron, a veteran of the Crimean War, led over 14,000 troops, a mixture of British Imperial Redcoats, colonial militia, and allied Maori, the Kupapa, into the Waikato. They did not just march, they built their way south, constructing the Great South Road, a military highway driven like a stake into the Kongitanga's heartland, followed by a chain of redoubts and telegraph wires. The Waikato Maori, under the leadership of Rewi Maniapoto and Tauhiao, the second Maori king, fought with a desperate, brilliant bravery. They had adapted the Papu, the gunfighter fortress, into a new masterpiece of trench warfare, seen most famously at Marimere and Rangiriri. But the British had overwhelming numbers, steam-powered ironclad gunboats on the Waikato River, and an endless supply of artillery. The war culminated in April 1864 at Orakau, the legendary last stand of the resistance. Here, a mixed group of 300 warriors, women and children, led by Rewi Maniapoto, were besieged in a hastily built pie by 1,400 British troops. The defenders had little food, almost no water, and were running low on ammunition. The British, respecting their courage, offered the women and children a chance to leave. The response from within the pie, a cry of defiant mana that still echoes in history, came from the chieftainess Ahumai Te Pairata. Kite mate ngatane, me mate anu nga wahineme nga tamariki. If the men are to die, the women and children must die also. Rewi Maniapoto added the final immortal line, Ka wauhai tonu matu, ake, ake, ake. We will fight on forever and ever and ever. The British stormed the PA, and the defenders, in a desperate breakout, were cut down as they fled, women among them. The Waikato War was over. The Kongitanga was broken, its people scattered, its leaders driven into the isolated, forested king country, where they would live as exiles in their own land. But the true weapon of the war was not the cannon, it was the law. While the fighting was still raging, the settler government in Auckland passed the New Zealand Settlements Act of 1863. This was the Raupatu, the Great Confiscation. This law, a brutal legal innovation, empowered the governor to declare any iwi that had been in rebellion, a term that meant any iwi that had resisted the crown's invasion, and to confiscate their land as punishment. This was not a land purchase. It was a state-sanctioned punitive seizure. It was utu on a national scale, enacted not with a mirror, but with the seal of the crown. The scale of the Raupatu was breathtaking. In the Waikato, 1.2 million acres of the richest, most fertile land, the ancestral heart of the Tainui people, was seized, leaving them landless and destitute, confined to the margins. In Taranaki, where conflict had flared again, 1.3 million acres were confiscated, a punishment for the rebellion that had begun at Waitara. In the Bay of Plenty, the lands of iwi who had bravely defeated the British at the famous Battle of Gate Pa were also seized. The act was a blunt and often cruel instrument. The lands of Kupapa, those Maori who had fought for the crown, were often confiscated right alongside the lands of the rebels, swallowed up in the arbitrary sweep of the surveyor's pen. The Raupatu was the death blow to the independent Maori economy. It was not just land that was taken, it was the Kumara Gardens, the eel weirs, the wahitapu, sacred sites, the forests for fowling, and the rivers for fishing. It was the economic base of the iwi, and its destruction meant the collapse of the social order. The rangatira had no way to provide for their people. The hapu had no place to stand. This was followed by the second, quieter, and perhaps more insidious weapon, the Native Land Court, established in 1865. This court's stated purpose was peaceful, to convert the traditional, communal, hapu-based ownership of Maori land, ahika, the burning fires of occupation, into individual British-style titles. In practice, it was a machine for dispossession. It forced iwi to prove their ownership in an alien adversarial court, often bankrupting them with legal fees. It would then issue a title to a few owners, who were then vulnerable to the immense pressure of Pakeha speculators and quickly became landless. The Raupatu had taken the land of the rebels by force. The Native Land Court was now patiently, legally, and relentlessly taking the land of the friendlies. By 1890, the wars were long over. The Posu was silent, but the Maori, who had owned 100% of Aotearoa in 1840, were now in possessions of less than a quarter of their country, and the most fertile parts were gone forever. The silence of the Piu gave way to the quiet, relentless scratching of the surveyor's pen and the gavel of the Native Land Court, weapons that proved, in the end, far more devastating than any musket. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Raupatu and the court's relentless individualization of title had achieved what the wars could not: the near total dispossession of the Maori people. The mana of the rangatira was broken, not in battle, but by poverty. The Kainga were no longer self-sufficient communities, but impoverished rural enclaves, islands of Maori life marooned in a sea of Pakeha-owned pasture. The people who had been the masters of this land, the descendants of Tane Mahuta and Tumatawenga, were now a landless rural proletariat, often living as tenants on the very ground their ancestors had defended with mere and musket, their ahika, the burning fires of occupation, reduced to a flicker. This was the nadir, the lowest point in the Maori story. The population, which had numbered perhaps 100,000 at the time of Cook's arrival, had collapsed under the combined weight of disease and the trauma of war and dispossession. By the census of 1896, the number of Maori had fallen to a terrifying low of just 42,000. It was in this grim twilight that the prevailing Pakeha wisdom, steeped in the fashionable bleak theories of social Darwinism, was that the Maori were a dying race, a noble but tragically doomed people who were, as one politician famously put it, smoothing the pillow of their extinction. Their sacred wahi tapu were desecrated, their paw sites plowed over, their language forbidden in the new native schools, and their children punished for speaking the tongue of their ancestors. Yet the race did not die. The Maori, the life force, was not extinguished. It was merely hidden, sheltered like an ember in the few remaining kainga. And from this generation, born in the shadow of defeat, a new kind of toa, or warrior, emerged. These were not men who wielded the taiaha. They were men who wielded the pen, the law book, and the medical text. They were the graduates of the new Pākehā universities, a group of brilliant, pragmatic leaders who formed what became known as the Young Maori Party. Men like Sir Maui Pomare, a doctor who dedicated his life to sanitation and health, fighting the diseases that had ravaged his people, Te Rangi Roa, Sir Peter Buck, a doctor and anthropologist who would fastidiously record the disappearing arts of his ancestors, and, most consequentially, Sir Apirana Ngata. Ngata was a political and intellectual genius from Ringarai-Puru, a rangatira who had mastered the Pākehā world without ever losing his own. As a member of parliament for nearly 4 decades, he became the architect of a slow, painful, and practical survival. His policy was not revolution, it was consolidation. He fought for land development schemes in the 1920s and 30s, painstakingly gathering the shattered, fragmented remnants of Maori land, those tiny, uneconomic shares left by the land court, and helping iwi consolidate them back into viable farms. He worked to revive the marae as the center of cultural life, encouraging the building of new, carved meeting houses, the ware wakairo we remember, as beacons of mana and identity. This was the first quiet renaissance, a desperate, internal effort to rebuild the hapu on the little land that remained. Then, for the second time in a generation, the world went to war. In 1939, as in 1914, Maori volunteered in huge numbers. Apirana Ngata was instrumental in forming the 28th Maori Battalion, a unit that was, in effect, a modern taua drawn from all the iwi of Aotearoa. This battalion became one of the most decorated and feared Allied units in the entire Second World War. On the battlefields of Greece, Crete, North Africa, and Italy, they fought with a disciplined ferocity, their mana blazing on a global stage. At Casino, their haka was heard in the ruins as they fixed bayonets. This shared sacrifice, this shedding of blood alongside Pākehā soldiers, bought Maori a new, undeniable place in the national story. But when these soldiers, these toa who had been treated as equals or superiors by British and American generals, returned home, they returned to a country that still, in many quiet ways, treated them as second-class citizens, a land where they could be refused service in a pub or a room in a hotel. The war had done something else. It had industrialized Aotearoa. The cities, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, were booming, their factories hungry for labor. This was the pull. The push was the reality of the rural homelands. Ngata's heroic efforts aside, there was simply not enough land left to support the Maori population, which, thanks to the health reforms of Pomare and a rising birth rate, was now rebounding with explosive speed. The future, it seemed, was not in the kainga, it was in the city. And so, beginning in the 1950s, the Great Heikemua, the Great Urban Migration, began. It was a demographic shift as profound as the musket wars. In 1945, Over 80% of the Maori population lived in their rural tribal homelands. By the late 1970s, that number would be completely inverted. Nearly 80% would be living in the cities. This was a new heke, a new migration, this time not by waka or on foot, but by bus and by train. Young Maori left the marae, the warapuni, and the direct daily presence of their elders, kaumatua, for the anonymity of the sprawling, Pakeha-dominated state house suburbs of South Auckland and the Hutt Valley. This migration was a new kind of crisis, a profound social and cultural dislocation. The fires of the ahi ka in the countryside truly did grow cold, as the marae were left to the old and the young. The vital, unbroken link between the Wakapapa genealogy and the Wenua land was severed for the first time. In the cities, these new urban Maori were often at the bottom of the economic ladder, facing systemic discrimination in housing, in employment, and in the justice system. They were stereotyped, isolated, and cut adrift from their cultural anchors. But this very dislocation, this act of gathering thousands of Maori from hundreds of different hapu and forcing them together in the same suburbs, the same factories, and the same pubs, created the fertile, compressed soil for the next and most explosive renaissance. They were no longer just Ngapuhi or Tainui or Ngatiporu. In the eyes of the Pakeha city, they were all simply Maori. And from this new, shared urban identity, a new pan-tribal consciousness, and a new, fiery political anger were about to be born. This great urban migration, this heikemua, had concentrated the people in the cities, but it had also concentrated their anger and their sense of loss. The 1960s and 1970s saw the birth of a new generation, an urban, educated, and bilingual generation who had grown up in the Pakeha world, had attended Pakeha universities, and had read their own hidden history. They had read the English text of the treaty, and they had read the Maori text of Te Tiriti, and for the first time they could see the chasm, the void of misunderstanding and bad faith that lay between them. This generation, the children of the migration, were not like their rural grandparents who had sought survival. This generation, embodied in activist groups like Nga Tamatoa, the Young Warriors, sought justice. They were the new Toa, their weapons not the mirror or the poo, but the protest placard, the legal argument, and the television camera. The Maori protest movement was born, a fiery, articulate, and media-savvy renaissance of political consciousness. This new Taua used the language of the treaty itself as its primary weapon, demanding that the Crown finally, after 130 years, honor the treaty. The nation was electrified by a series of powerful, symbolic confrontations. In 1975, the Great Waya, or matriarch Weena Cooper, a woman of immense traditional mana, led a haki march from the very northern tip of Tauranga Wairoa, the spirits leaping off place, all the way south to the steps of Parliament in Wellington. This was Te Ropu Marakite, the people with foresight. It was a heke of thousands, a land march that took a month, growing as it walked, its banner proclaiming the movement's single desperate cry, "Not one more acre." It was a profound, televised spectacle that brought the story of Maori land loss, the Raupatu, into the living rooms of stunned Pakeha New Zealand for the first time. Then, in 1977, the focus turned to a piece of ancestral land in the heart of Auckland, a headland called Takaparohau, or Bastion Point. This was the Turanga Waiwai of the Ngati Watua Iwi, land that had been taken by the crown over decades for public works and defense, until the Awi was left huddled in a tiny village on the slopes below. Now, the government proposed to sell this surplus public land for luxury housing. The Awi, led by Joe Hawke, staged an occupation, a reassertion of their Ahi Ka, burning fires. For 507 days, they occupied their ancestral PA site, building a new temporary village. The occupation was a peaceful, defiant, and deeply spiritual act until, in May 1978, the government responded with overwhelming force. In a massive pre-dawn police and military operation, 222 protesters were arrested, and the marae and homes were bulldozed flat. But the image, broadcast on the evening news, of the Kaumatua elders being led away from their own land was a public relations disaster for the crown and a profound moral victory for Maori. This rising tide of protest, this undeniable evidence of a deep historical grievance, forced the crown's hand. In 1975, the very same year the Land March began, the government passed the Treaty of Waitangi Act, a quiet, seemingly bureaucratic piece of legislation that would in time prove to be the most revolutionary document since the treaty itself. It established the Waitangi Tribunal, a new kind of court, a permanent commission of inquiry. Its job was simple: to hear claims from any Maori who believed they had been prejudiced by a crown action that was a breach of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. At first, its power was almost laughably limited. It was forbidden from investigating the past. It could only hear new grievances, those arising after 1975. It was dismissed by many as a token, toothless gesture. But then, in 1985, came the true earthquake. A new government, facing continued relentless pressure, passed an amendment. The tribunal was given retrospective powers. It could now investigate any breach of the treaty by the crown, no matter when it had occurred, all the way back to the signing in 1840. The great locked door of history had been thrown open. The Raupatu, the illegal land shark purchases, the theft of the Taranaki coast, the confiscation of the Waikato, all of it was now, for the first time, subject to a legal and historical inquiry. The iwi, Ngai Tahu in the south, Tainui in the Waikato, Ngati Poru, Ngati Awa, began to meticulously prepare their cases, their claims, which were in effect the tribal memory of their own dispossession, now to be laid at the feet of the crown. The tribunal's hearings were a new kind of hui. They were not held in sterile courtrooms, but on the marae of the claimants, where the Kaumatua could speak in Te Reo Maori, their voices rising as they recited the Wakapapa and the oral histories of their loss. This was a process of national truth and reconciliation, a profound, painful, and cathartic unearthing of a buried past. The tribunal, using both this oral testimony and the Crown's own dusty archives, began to issue its reports. These were damning, scholarly, and irrefutable, finding that the Crown had, in almost every case, acted in breach of its treaty promises, dishonorably and often illegally. These findings led to the final modern chapter, the treaty settlement era. The tribunal could not give the land back. It was now covered in cities and farms, but it could recommend that the Crown negotiate a settlement. The Iwi'i, whose mana had been shattered and whose economies had been destroyed, were now finally compensated. The settlements, beginning with the great Tainui Waikato Rapatu settlement in 1995 and the Ngai Tahu settlement in 1998, were vast, complex agreements. They consisted of three parts: a formal crown apology, a profound act of utu that restored the mana of the iwi, a cultural redress, which returned sacred mountains, rivers, and pa sites to tribal control, and a financial redress, a quantum of hundreds of millions of dollars, not as a handout, but as a negotiated partial compensation for the immense economic losses of the past. This new economic power has fueled a stunning cultural renaissance. The Kohanga Reo, language nests, movement, started by Maori women in 1982, has saved Te Reo Maori from the brink of extinction, and it is now an official language of the nation. The waka hurua that first crossed the Pacific are being rebuilt, and a new generation is navigating by the stars once more. Maori artists, writers, and filmmakers have taken their stories to the world with a new, uncompromising confidence. The mana of the iwi has been rekindled, their ahika in the cities, and on the marae burning brighter than ever. The story of the Maori, which began in the mists of Hawaii, which raised the pa on the hills, which survived the pu, the pen, and the raupatu, is not the story of a dying race. It is one of the most profound and powerful stories of survival, adaptation, and resilience on Earth. It is the story of a people who, having been brought to the very edge of the void, looked back to the wakapapa of their ancestors and found the strength to paddle their waka forward into a new bicultural dawn. And in that quiet, strengthening light, the long, troubled history of Aotearoa continues to be written, its two peoples bound at last by the single sacred text they both must honor,